He called her impossible. She proved him wrong in 2 words. In a boardroom where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, Nathan Mercer, a 32-year-old single father who had survived worse rooms than this one, said exactly what he should never have said, out loud. In front of 11 executives, 2 legal consultants, and a woman who had built an empire before most people her age had figured out their coffee order. The joke landed wrong. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't fade. And Victoria Ashcroft's answer, quiet, precise, devastating, changed everything neither of them had been ready to name. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The meeting had been scheduled for 9. By 8:53, Nathan Mercer was already in his seat, 3rd chair from the left, laptop open, coffee cooling beside his notebook. The paper kind, which his assistant had once called aggressively retro, and which Nathan had kept using anyway, out of something that wasn't quite stubbornness but lived in the same neighborhood. He was reviewing the Q3 campaign deck for the 4th time, not because he didn't know it cold, but because knowing it cold was the only way he'd learned to walk into rooms like this one. Rooms where the furniture cost more than his first car. Rooms where confidence was currency and hesitation was something people smelled on you, like fear. The Ashcroft Group's Boston headquarters occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Boylston Street that managed to feel both historic and aggressively modern. Exposed brick on one wall, floor-to-ceiling glass on the other, as if the architects couldn't agree on what decade they were designing for and eventually stopped arguing. Nathan had been coming here for 8 months. He still didn't entirely trust the elevator. He checked his phone under the table. One text from his mother. Sophie ate her oatmeal, said it was disgusting but fine. She's your kid. He smiled before he could stop himself, typed back, "That's my girl," locked the screen, put the phone away. Around him, the room filled slowly. Ashcroft's senior team arrived in the particular way of people who had attended enough of these meetings to stop pretending they were exciting, unhurried, professionally pleasant, carrying the specific exhaustion of people who were very good at their jobs and knew it hadn't made things easier. Nathan knew most of them by now. Marcus Webb, head of operations, who drank 3 espressos before 10 and became a different, more dangerous person after noon. Diane Cho, chief legal officer, who had the habit of listening to everything with her eyes slightly closed, which made younger people underestimate her constantly and was almost certainly deliberate. Paul Renner, CFO, who laughed too loud at things that weren't funny and went quiet when things were. Nathan had spent the better part of a year learning these people the way he learned every room. Carefully, without making it obvious that he was doing it. He was good at invisible work. It was one of the things that made him effective, and occasionally, he suspected, slightly unsettling to people who preferred their competition more legible. Victoria Ashcroft arrived at 9:02. Not late. She was never late, exactly. But entering a room at 9:02 when the meeting was called for, 9 was its own kind of statement, and Nathan had long since concluded that most of what Victoria Ashcroft did in professional settings was, on some level, a statement. The walk, the silence before she spoke, the way she could make a nod feel like a verdict. She was 30 years old and had been running the Ashcroft Group for 4 years, inheriting it at 26 when her father stepped back from day-to-day management following a health scare that the press had speculated about extensively and that Victoria had never once addressed publicly. In those 4 years, she had expanded the company from 11 luxury properties to 34, absorbed 2 smaller hospitality chains, turned down a private equity buyout that would have made her personally wealthier than she already was, and fired 2 executive directors who had, in the words of one financial journalist, made the mistake of thinking she'd be easy to manage. The journalist had meant it as a compliment. Nathan had read the piece on the commuter rail one morning and thought, yeah, that tracks. She took her seat at the head of the table. Not the geographic head, the room wasn't set up that way, but it became the head of the table the moment she sat down, which was the kind of thing Nathan noticed and never said out loud, opened her portfolio, and looked up. "Let's begin," she said. And they began. The first 40 minutes went cleanly. Nathan walked through the campaign framework, the brand positioning for the new Ashcroft property in Charleston, the audience segmentation data, the projected reach numbers. He had done this kind of presentation enough times to know when a room was with him and when it was tolerating him. And this room was with him, which meant he could breathe at about 80% capacity and save the remaining 20 for the moment things got complicated. Things got complicated at 43 minutes in, when Victoria stopped him mid-sentence. "The lifestyle segmentation," she said. "Slide 14. He clicked back. She was looking at the screen with the expression she wore when something was almost right, which Nathan had learned was distinct from the expression she wore when something was wrong. Harder to read, more careful, and somehow more dangerous. "The experiential affluence bracket," she said. "You've defined it too narrowly. I defined it using your customer data. I know what data you used." She wasn't sharp about it, just clear. "The issue is that the data is a snapshot of who our current guests are. The campaign's purpose is to reach people who aren't our guests yet. Which is why I built the aspirational overlay on slide 16. The segmentation on 14 is the baseline. 16 is where we're extending it. The extension doesn't connect back to the baseline in a way that justifies the media spend." Nathan looked at her. She was looking at the slide. Around the table, everyone else was looking at the middle distance with the focused neutrality of people who had learned that picking a side in these moments was not worth what it cost. "It does," Nathan said. "If you follow the logic from 14 to 15 to 16, the spend allocation makes sense." "I followed the logic. The problem is that your logic and our acquisition goals aren't aligned." "Then maybe," Nathan said. And he knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, he absolutely knew that he should stop here, reroute, take a breath, find a different door. But the meeting had been running for 43 minutes, and he hadn't slept more than 5 hours, and Sophie had been up twice in the night with a cough that wasn't serious, but was the kind of thing that kept you awake anyway, alert in the dark, listening. Maybe the issue is that the acquisition goals keep shifting. A small silence. "They don't shift," Victoria said. "They evolve. There's a difference." In my experience, the difference between shifting and evolving is usually just a matter of who's describing it. Marcus Webb across the table became very interested in his coffee cup. "Your experience," Victoria said, and her voice was entirely level, "is valuable, which is why you're in this room. But this campaign framework has 3 structural gaps that we need to address before I'm comfortable taking it to the board." 3 gaps. Nathan said it without inflection. 3. Which are? She named them. They were real gaps. He could see that as she spoke, which was the most irritating part. But they were also gaps that emerged from constraints she had set, timelines that her team had moved twice, and a brief that had been revised 4 times before Nathan had even seen it. He said so. She acknowledged 2 of those points and pushed back on the 3rd. He pushed back on her pushback. Paul Renner poured himself water and drank it with the energy of a man who wished it were something stronger. This was, more or less, how every meeting with Victoria Ashcroft went. Not badly, exactly. Not unproductively. But with a friction that never fully smoothed out, no matter how long they'd been working together. Nathan had initially assumed it was him, that he was doing something wrong, taking the wrong tonal register, pushing when he should have yielded or yielding when he should have pushed. He'd spent the first 2 months quietly second-guessing his approach, recalibrating, adjusting. And then one evening, waiting for a cab outside this same building, he'd overheard Diane Cho on the phone saying to someone, "No, she's always like this with people she actually listens to." And he had stood on the sidewalk in October cold and turned that sentence over in his head for the entire ride home. It hadn't made the meetings easier, but it had changed something about how he walked into them. "Look," Nathan said, pulling himself back to the room, "I can address the gaps. I'll have a revised version to your team by Thursday." "Wednesday," Victoria said. "I have another client with a Thursday deadline. Wednesday isn't realistic." "Then make it realistic." He looked at her. She looked at him. This was the other thing about Victoria Ashcroft. She didn't look away first. Not out of aggression, just out of what appeared to be a genuine lack of interest in doing so, as if blinking first in a professional disagreement had simply never occurred to her as an option. "Thursday," Nathan said. Something that might have been the very distant cousin of amusement moved across her face and disappeared. "Fine," she said. "Thursday." They moved on. The next 40 minutes covered budget allocation, venue partnerships, and the social media rollout. And Nathan found his footing again, that specific groove where the work took over and everything else went quiet. He was good at this, genuinely, not in the way that people were good at things because they'd practiced until the inadequacy wore smooth, but in the way where the work itself made sense to him, where the patterns were visible and the logic connected, and he could see 3 moves ahead while still paying attention to where he was. That was the thing he'd never quite figured out how to say in a room like this. That the reason he pushed back was because he cared about it. Not about being right, about the work being right. He suspected, though he'd never said it to her, that Victoria understood this, that it was part of what made them so persistently, exhaustingly difficult with each other. The meeting was winding down. Laptops were closing, notebooks flipping shut, the soft, institutional sounds of a room preparing to return to the rest of the day. Nathan was gathering his materials when Marcus Webb leaned back in his chair and said, with the cheerful timing of a man who had been waiting for a lighter moment, "I have to say, Nathan, I don't know how you do it. 8 months of going head-to-head with Victoria, and you're still standing." Nathan had meant it as easy, as collegial, as the kind of self-deprecating professional joke that lands in rooms like this and gets a polite laugh and is forgotten by the elevator. He said, "Honestly, Marcus, I think it's a survival instinct. I'm pretty sure no man could actually live with her impossible standards. I'd need hazard pay." The laugh he'd been expecting didn't come. What came instead was silence. Not the silence of a bad joke. He'd told bad jokes in rooms before, knew what that silence felt like. The quick pivot and the polite recovery. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that happened when something hit closer to an edge than the person speaking had intended. He felt it the moment the words were out. That fractional pause before the room realizes what it just heard. Diane Cho had gone very still. Paul Renner was looking at the table. Marcus Webb had the expression of a man who had handed someone a lit match in a room full of paper and was now reconsidering his life choices. Nathan turned, slowly, because some part of him already knew, to look at Victoria. She was looking at him. She hadn't moved. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, her portfolio closed, her posture exactly as it had been for the last hour and a half. The only thing that had changed was the way she was looking at him, which was with a directness that was different from her usual professional focus, quieter somehow, and much more precise. A beat. 2 beats. "You already do," she said. That was all. 2 words. Quiet, unhurried, and completely certain. Then she gathered her portfolio, thanked the room, and walked out. Nathan drove home on autopilot. This was not unusual. He had developed the particular highway competence of someone who spent a lot of time thinking about things other than driving. But usually his autopilot was occupied with work, campaign architecture, client dynamics, the particular mental geometry of fitting a strategic idea into a shape that other people could also see. Tonight it was occupied with 2 words. "You already do." He pulled into the driveway of the house in Somerville, the one he'd bought 3 years ago with the specific calculation that its school district was good, its backyard was large enough, and the mortgage was high but survivable, and sat in the car for a minute after he turned off the engine, staring at the lit window of the kitchen where his mother was visible moving around behind the glass, probably making tea, probably having also fed Sophie dinner, helped with the bath, supervised the teeth brushing, and performed the approximately 400 small logistical acts that went into ending a 6-year-old's day. His mother had never once complained about any of this, which, honestly, worried him more than complaints would have. He went inside. Sophie was already asleep somehow, having apparently abandoned her recent campaign to extend bedtime to a reasonable 9 o'clock by means of increasingly creative negotiation tactics. His mother, Ellen Mercer, was sitting at the kitchen table with her tea and a library book, and she looked up when he came in with the particular expression she reserved for situations where she had something to say, but was deciding whether to say it. "Long day?" she asked. "Medium long. There's pasta on the stove." "Thanks, Mom." He put his bag down, went to the stove. The pasta was good. She had a habit of cooking things from scratch that Nathan associated with a different era of life before everything had to be fast. and he stood there eating it out of the pot like a person who had given up on the performance of having it together for the day. "How's the Ashcroft account?" his mother asked. "Fine. You have the same voice you had when you were 16, and the car had a scratch on it, and everything was also fine." Nathan put the pot back, turned around. His mother was watching him with the patient, slightly merciless clarity that had terrified him as a teenager and that he had grown to understand was simply what being genuinely known by another person felt like. "I said something stupid in a meeting today," he said. "How stupid?" "Medium stupid. Joke that didn't land, except..." He paused, tried to locate the right word for what had happened, didn't find one. "I don't know. It was weird." "Weird how?" Victoria Ashcroft said something back, 2 words, and it was... He stopped again. "I don't know. I'm still thinking about it." His mother looked at him for a moment over the rim of her tea mug. "Nathan," she said, with the tone of a woman who had watched her son be brilliant at understanding other people and systematically obtuse about himself for 3 decades. "Tell me something." "What?" "This woman who you talk about every other day, almost always in the context of how frustrating she is, and how difficult she is, and how she makes every single project twice as complicated as it needs to be." "That's accurate." "You ever think about why someone that difficult keeps asking for you specifically?" Nathan opened his mouth, closed it. "Good night, sweetheart," his mother said, and picked up her book. But he checked on Sophie before he went to bed. He always did. This was not a deliberate parenting strategy, but simply something he couldn't not do. A compulsion that had existed since the first night he'd brought her home, this small, terrifying fact of a person, and found himself standing over her crib at 2 a.m. just to confirm she was still breathing. 6 years had adjusted the terror, but not the instinct. She was asleep on her stomach, her hair fanned out across the pillow, one arm extending off the edge of the mattress, in the absolute confidence of a child who had never once fallen out of bed and therefore had no framework for understanding why this might be a concern. There was a drawing on her nightstand. She'd gone through a phase of drawing every night before bed, and Nathan picked it up without turning on the light, making out the shapes in the hallway glow. A house. 2 figures, one large, one small. A dog, which they did not have, and which Sophie had been lobbying for with escalating sophistication since her 5th birthday. A son in the corner with a face, because she was 6 and sons had faces. In the top right corner, where she usually put the sky, she'd drawn something extra. A 3rd figure, smaller than the big one, bigger than the Sophie one. Female, probably. She'd given it long hair, the way she drew women. He stood there looking at it for longer than made sense. Then he put it back exactly where it had been, kissed his daughter's forehead so lightly she didn't stir, and went to his own room, where he lay in the dark for what felt like a very long time before he stopped thinking about anything. Thursday came. Nathan delivered the revised campaign framework with the 3 gaps addressed, plus a 4th structural change he'd identified on his own and fixed without mentioning it, because pointing it out would have been annoying and fixing it silently was more useful. He sent it to Victoria's team at 7:14 in the morning, which was early enough to signal that he'd taken the deadline seriously, but not so early as to suggest he'd been up all night, which he almost had been, but which was information he preferred to keep to himself. Victoria responded at 8:47. The revisions are solid. The 4th change, the media sequencing, is better than what we had originally. Good work. That was it. No comma after originally. No sign-off. Just the words, clean and direct. Nathan read it twice. Wrote back, thanks. The Charleston launch timeline still needs to be adjusted by about 10 days if you want the Q1 numbers to hold. I'll send a note on that separately. Her response came back in 4 minutes. Noted. Send it today. He sent it. She replied. This was how they communicated. Back and forth, no pleasantries, no throat clearing, just the work and what needed to happen next, which Nathan had come to understand was the clearest sign he'd seen from anyone in years that they actually respected his time. He was on the phone with a different client, a restaurant group in Cambridge whose rebrand had gone sideways for reasons that were entirely their own fault, but which they were artfully presenting as his, when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't have saved. He let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, another text from Victoria. Check your voicemail. It's important. He excused himself from the call, which required a level of professional maneuvering he was not entirely proud of, and listened to the message. It was Marcus Webb. His voice had the specific quality of someone delivering news they weren't entirely sure was good or bad. Nathan, just got out of a board call. The New York acquisition. The Meridian properties. There's been a development. Victoria's going to reach out, but heads up. They want you in New York. Both of you. Full presentation to the Meridian principals, week after next. The board's calling it a collaboration, but between you and me, they want you there because Victoria won't go without the campaign architecture locked, and you're the only one she trusts on the strategy side. Anyway, she'll explain. Good luck. He stood in the hallway outside his client's conference room, phone in hand, processing this. The only one she trusts on the strategy side. He didn't know why that landed the way it did. He'd been told by clients before that they valued his work, that they wanted him specifically, that the account wouldn't function without him, which was always flattering and almost always 90% true. He knew how to receive that kind of information professionally. But this felt different, and he knew why it felt different, and he was choosing very deliberately not to look too closely at why. His phone rang. Victoria. He picked up. Did Marcus call you? She said by way of hello. He left a voicemail. New York, 2 weeks. The Meridian acquisition has reached the final stage and the principals want a full strategic presentation before they sign. The board wants both of us. I gathered. I need you to know that I advocated for this arrangement because the campaign strategy is essential to the presentation's success, not for any other reason. Nathan paused. Was there another reason someone might have? A brief silence on her end. The board has been... She stopped. Started again. There's been some speculation about the nature of our working relationship. I want to be clear that my recommendation was purely professional. Okay, Nathan said. Okay, she repeated, and it sounded like she'd expected him to say more and wasn't sure what to do with the fact that he hadn't. Send me the timeline and the brief, he said. I'll start on the New York framework this week. I'll have it to you by end of day. Great. Another pause. Shorter this time. The meeting today? She said. The comment you made. He'd known this was coming and had somehow also convinced himself it wasn't going to come. It was a bad joke, he said. I shouldn't have said it. No, she agreed. You shouldn't have. I'm sorry. A pause. My answer was also... She stopped. It was more than I intended to say. Okay, Nathan said again, more quietly. It won't affect the work. I know it won't. Then we're fine. We're fine. She hung up. Nathan stood in the hallway for a moment. Through the glass door, he could see his client pacing, phone to his ear, operating with the particular energy of a man who is about to make several additional mistakes. Nathan would go back in there in a minute. He would fix what could be fixed, redirect what couldn't, and deliver something good despite the circumstances, which was most of what the job actually was. But for just a second, he stayed where he was, in the quiet, with a feeling he hadn't had in a long time and couldn't quite name, something between being seen and being afraid of it, sitting together in his chest like they'd agreed to share the space without asking him first. Then he went back in. He fixed what needed fixing. He did the work. He was very good at that. Tab. That Friday night, he was on the kitchen floor helping Sophie finish a geography puzzle. The United States, foam pieces, each state a different color, which had seemed educational and now seemed like an elaborate trap he'd walked into willingly. When she looked up at him with the sudden, disconcerting directness of a child who had just thought of something. Dad, she said, do you have a best friend? He considered this with the gravity it deserved. I have good friends. That's not the same. No, he agreed. It's not. She pressed Ohio into its spot with the satisfaction of someone settling a matter. My best friend is Clara. She knows everything about me and she doesn't care about the bad parts. Nathan looked at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes, dark, wide-set, observant, and his tendency to deliver observations that landed like stones dropped into still water, concentric circles spreading outward. That's a really good definition of a best friend, he said. Do you have someone like that? He reached for Wyoming, turned it over, put it down. "I'm working on it," he said. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went back to the puzzle. Through the kitchen window, the Boston evening settled into dark. Somewhere in the city, in a corner office or a hotel bar or the back of a car moving through Friday traffic, Victoria Ashcroft was probably still working, because she was almost always still working. And Nathan was sitting on the floor with his daughter thinking about a woman who had said 2 words in a boardroom and somehow rearranged something in him that he hadn't known was movable. He found Wyoming's spot, pressed it in. The puzzle was almost finished. The brief arrived at 11:47 on Friday night. Nathan was still up, not because he'd planned to be, but because Sophie had woken with the cough again, the dry, persistent one that had been cycling through her for 2 weeks. And after 40 minutes of water and back rubbing and the specific negotiation of getting a 6-year-old back to sleep without committing to anything that would need to be undone later, he'd found himself too alert to go back to bed and had ended up at the kitchen table with his laptop and a cup of tea he'd forgotten to drink. The email from Victoria's assistant had a subject line that said, "Meridian Acquisition, NYC Prep Package," and contained 3 attachments, a detailed timeline, and a note at the bottom that was not from the assistant, but from Victoria herself, appended without preamble. "The principals are more conservative than the Ashcroft board. The campaign framing will need to reflect that without losing its ambition. I'd like your read on the property briefs before we talk strategy." V. Nathan opened the first attachment. Read for 20 minutes, opened the second, read for 40. By 1:15 in the morning, he had 3 pages of handwritten notes, a cold cup of tea, and a clearer picture of why Victoria wanted him in New York specifically, which had nothing to do with what Marcus Webb had implied, and everything to do with the fact that the Meridian acquisition was more complicated than anyone on her board had publicly acknowledged. The properties were extraordinary. 5 boutique hotels across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Hudson Valley, each with a distinct identity and a loyal guest base that had been built over 15 years by a family operation that was now, for reasons the brief described as transitional ownership considerations, and which Nathan translated as "the founder is 73 and his kids aren't interested," finally willing to sell. The asking price was significant. The opportunity was larger. But the Meridian principals weren't selling to the highest bidder. They were selling to whoever could convince them their properties would still feel like themselves in 10 years, which meant the strategic case wasn't financial. It was cultural. It was about identity and continuity, and the question of whether a luxury hospitality empire absorbing a family operation would preserve what made that operation worth absorbing in the first place. Nathan understood why Victoria wanted his read before the strategy conversation. He also understood, reading between the lines of the brief, that this was the kind of presentation where the wrong approach didn't just lose the deal. It damaged the company's reputation with exactly the audience they most needed to court going forward. No pressure. He wrote back to her at 1:43. "Read the briefs. The Meridian principals aren't evaluating the offer. They're evaluating whether Ashcroft is the kind of company that can be trusted with something they built. The campaign architecture needs to lead with stewardship, not acquisition. I have ideas. Call me Monday." He hit send, went to bed, lay in the dark listening to the house settle. His phone lit up at 2:09. A message from Victoria. "Stewardship. Yes, that's the word I've been trying to find for 3 days." Monday. He looked at it for a moment in the dark, put the phone face down on the nightstand, closed his eyes. It took him a while to sleep. The following 2 weeks were the most productive and most disorganizing of Nathan's professional life, which was saying something because his professional life had included a rebranding project for a tech company that had changed its name 3 times mid-campaign, and a campaign launch that had coincided with a citywide power outage and a client who had once called him at 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve to discuss font choices. The difference was that none of those projects had involved being in daily communication with Victoria Ashcroft, and none of them had involved the specific quality of focus that descended on him every time they got into the actual work of it. The way the room, literal or metaphorical, narrowed to just the problem, and the two of them circling it from different angles, pushing at it, finding where it held and where it gave. They met 3 times in person before the New York trip. Once in the Boylston Street office, where they spent 4 hours on the foundational strategy framework and produced something that was genuinely better than what Nathan had brought in. Better, because of the argument, because of the place where his instincts and her knowledge of the properties intersected and generated a third thing neither of them would have reached alone. Once at a restaurant near Nathan's office that neither of them ate much at because they were both looking at printed briefs instead of menus, and the server had eventually stopped checking in with the particular expression of a person who had given up. Once on a video call that was supposed to be 90 minutes and ran to 3 hours and 40 minutes, ending at 11:50 on a Wednesday night when Nathan finally looked up and realized Sophie's lunch wasn't made for tomorrow. "I have to go," he said. Victoria looked up from her screen. She'd been mid-sentence about the brand positioning for the Hudson Valley property, making a point Nathan had been about to push back on, and the interruption landed in the middle of her thought like something dropped. "It's nearly midnight," she said. "I know. I need to make my kids lunch." A pause. "Now. If I don't do it now, I'll forget, and she'll end up with whatever's in the vending machine at the after-school program, which last time was a bag of pretzels and a granola bar, which she reported to me with the energy of someone filing a complaint." Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Not amusement exactly. More like the arrival of information that was reconfiguring something. "How old is she?" Victoria asked. This was the first time she had ever asked. 6, Nathan said. "Almost 7. She's very opinionated about lunches." "What is she like?" "Turkey and cheese, no mustard, cut diagonally, which matters apparently. Grapes on the side, the green ones. If I put red, she'll eat them, but she'll mention it." Victoria looked at him for a moment that stretched 2 beats past professional. "Make the lunch," she said. "We'll pick this up tomorrow." He made the lunch. He picked it up tomorrow. The work continued. What he noticed over those 2 weeks was the specific way Victoria engaged with problems, the way she moved around an idea methodically, testing each side, not satisfied with a solution until she understood not just that it worked, but why it worked, and whether it would still work under different conditions. It was the opposite of creative instinct, which was what Nathan mostly ran on, and the tension between those two approaches had been the source of most of their friction over the past 8 months. But in the preparation for New York, something changed, not in how they each operated, but in the ratio. The friction started producing heat that was useful instead of just uncomfortable. They were still disagreeing constantly, but the disagreements had a different texture, less about territory and more about getting it right. And Nathan found himself, more than once, changing his position because she'd shown him something he'd missed, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to and which he handled with imperfect grace. "You're doing it again," Victoria said one afternoon, not looking up from her notes. "Doing what?" "The thing where you concede a point by restating it slightly differently so it sounds like you thought of it." Nathan looked at her. "That's not what I'm doing." "It's absolutely what you're doing. You've done it 3 times today." "I'm synthesizing." "You're synthesizing my point into language that sounds more like yours." She did look up then. "I don't mind. Just name it." He held her gaze. "Fine. You were right about the Hudson Valley positioning. The cultural stewardship angle works better if it leads rather than follows." "Thank you." "You're very annoying." "I know," she said, with zero indication that this bothered her, and went back to her notes. He stared at the side of her face for a moment, the concentration she brought to a page, the slight crease between her brows, the absolute certainty with which she inhabited her own thinking, and then went back to his own notes before the looking became something that needed to be explained. The train to New York left South Station on a Tuesday morning at 7:45. Nathan had taken the Acela before. It was the obvious business choice, faster than driving, simpler than flying, a solid 2.5 hours in which he could usually get a meaningful amount of work done. He arrived at the station at 7:15 with a coffee, his bag, and the particular low-grade anxiety of someone who had arranged for his mother to stay at the house and had still checked 3 times that Sophie's Wednesday schedule was written on the whiteboard and that the pediatrician's number was on the refrigerator. His mother had watched him check the whiteboard for the 3rd time and said, "Nathan, she survived before you invented the whiteboard system." "The whiteboard system works." "She's fine. Go to New York." He went to New York. Or he was going to New York. He found his seat, business class, window, which he'd booked 2 weeks ago, and discovered, with the specific surprise of someone who had somehow not anticipated this, that Victoria Ashcroft was in the seat across the table from him. She was already working, laptop open, coffee beside it, a stack of printed pages organized with the precision of someone who had a strong relationship with paperclips. She glanced up when he sat down. "I booked this seat 2 weeks ago," Nathan said. "So did I." "There are 2 seats at this table." "Yes," she agreed, and went back to her screen. He settled in, got his own laptop out, drank his coffee. For the first 20 minutes, they worked in parallel silence, the kind that didn't require anything from either of them, and Nathan noticed that this particular silence was different from the professional silence of the conference room, less held, more natural, the way 2 people who have been in enough rooms together eventually stop performing the fact that they're in a room together. The train cleared the city and picked up speed. Outside the window, the Massachusetts landscape did what it always did in early spring, which was provide evidence that winter had been serious about itself, but was now, tentatively, reconsidering. Brown fields with patches of green just starting, bare trees with buds that hadn't committed yet. "The opening of the presentation," Victoria said without preamble. "I want to rethink it." "Which part?" "The company history section. It's too much about us." Nathan turned from the window. "We're presenting to potential acquisition targets. Some context about the company is necessary." "Context, yes, but the first 10 minutes currently read as a portfolio showcase, and the Meridian principals aren't evaluating our portfolio. They know the portfolio. What they don't know is whether we understand what they've built. So lead with them." "Lead with them," she confirmed. "Their story, their properties, what the Beaumont family, Meridian's founding family, actually created, in their words, in the way they'd want to hear it described." Nathan thought about this. "Do we have enough material?" "The brief is fairly thin on the Beaumont history. I've done additional research." She turned her laptop to face him. "I spent the last week going through every interview and profile I could find with Thomas Beaumont going back 15 years. He talks about his hotels the way other people talk about their children. He doesn't want to sell to someone who sees them as assets." Nathan leaned in to read the screen. She'd compiled the material into a document. Quotes, themes, recurring language, the specific words Thomas Beaumont used across multiple interviews when he talked about hospitality, about guests, about what made a hotel feel like a place rather than a transaction. "This is good," Nathan said. "I know." Then after a beat, "It took a while." He looked at her. "You did all this yourself, not your research team?" "My research team would have given me a fact sheet. This required—" She paused, seeming to search for the word. "Reading between the lines." "Reading between the lines isn't usually what CEOs do at midnight on a Saturday." "How do you know what I do at midnight on a Saturday?" "The timestamps on the document." She looked at the screen. The document had been last modified at 11:58 on Saturday. She closed the laptop slightly, which was almost funny, the first thing he'd ever seen her do that was close to embarrassed. "I find it easier to do certain things myself," she said, and her tone had shifted a fraction, become more careful, as if she'd accidentally said more than she'd intended and was now deciding whether to walk it back. Nathan didn't say anything. He'd learned over 8 months that there were moments with Victoria where silence was more useful than response, where the thing she was almost saying needed space rather than prompting. "My team is good," she said, "but there are things they approach as tasks. I needed this to be—" Another pause. "I needed to understand it, not just have it." He nodded. "The Beaumont properties," he said. "You actually like them?" She looked at him. "I haven't seen them." "You don't need to have seen a place to like it. You can like what it stands for, what it represents about what hospitality can be." He gestured at the laptop. "You spent your Saturday night going through 15 years of Thomas Beaumont's interviews. That's not professional diligence, that's interest." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Outside, Connecticut was happening. Highways, water, the particular mid-state landscape of the Northeast Corridor that was neither city nor country, but something in between. "He built the first property with his wife," she said, "in 1991. They couldn't afford staff for the first 2 years, so they ran it themselves. She did the front desk and the breakfast service. He did everything else. She wasn't looking at the window. She was looking at the table. There's an interview from 2004 where he says the reason they survived those years wasn't the business plan. It was that they genuinely wanted their guests to feel looked after. He says, "We just wanted people to feel like someone was happy they'd arrived." Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. "That's the opening of the presentation," he said. She looked up. "The quote?" "That specific idea. That's the entire emotional foundation. Everything we're proposing about stewardship, about cultural continuity, about what it means for Ashcroft to absorb these properties, it all needs to live inside that sentence." He reached for his notebook, started writing. Someone was happy they'd arrived. That's what we're promising to preserve. Victoria watched him write. He was aware of it. Her attention had a quality that wasn't intrusive but was unmistakable. The focus of someone who was evaluating and not bothering to pretend otherwise. "You do that," she said. He didn't look up. "Do what?" "Find the center of something and go directly there. Most strategists I've worked with build toward the core idea. You start there. Starting anywhere else wastes time. It also makes people nervous. When someone goes straight to the heart of something, it feels like they're skipping steps. Are the steps important? Sometimes they're the whole point." He looked up. She was serious. This wasn't a criticism. It was an observation, and the distinction mattered. "Is that why you push back on my proposals?" he asked. "Not because the core idea is wrong, but because I haven't shown the path?" She considered it. "Partly. Also, sometimes the core idea is wrong." "Fair." The train had hit its rhythm now, that specific high-speed vibration that was almost meditative if you stopped fighting it. Nathan's coffee was cold, but he drank it anyway. Victoria had returned to her screen, but the quality of her focus had changed slightly. Less sealed off, more open at the edges. "Can I ask you something?" Nathan said. She glanced up. "You're going to regardless. The board putting us on this together. You said you advocated for it." "I did." "Why me specifically? Your company has 5 senior strategists on retainer. Any of them could have built this presentation." Victoria looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding how honest to be. He'd learned that expression too, over 8 months. It was the most unguarded thing about her. "Because any of them would have told me what I wanted to hear," she said. "You don't." "I'm difficult." "You're accurate. There's a difference." She looked back at her screen. "Also, you understand what I'm trying to build. Not the brand, not the revenue targets. What I'm actually trying to build." A pause. "That's rarer than it sounds." Nathan turned back to his notebook. The train ran south. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence between them had developed a new quality. Not heavy, not performed, just present. Like something that had been working toward this for a while and had finally arrived without making a production of it. At some point, he didn't check the time, Victoria closed her laptop and looked out the window. He noticed because she didn't usually stop working without a stated reason. "My father built the first Ashcroft property when I was 4, she said. "I grew up in hotels. Literally. We lived in the flagship property on the vineyard for 2 years while our house was being renovated, and I thought that was how everyone lived, in this beautiful place where everything was taken care of and people smiled when you walked through the lobby." She paused. "I didn't understand until I was much older that the smiling was professional." Nathan waited. "He always said the hospitality business was about making people feel significant," she continued. "He was good at it. He could walk into a room and make every person in it feel like they were the most important one there." She was quiet for a moment. "I never learned how to do that. I don't have that thing he had. The warmth at scale." "You have something else," Nathan said. She looked at him. "What?" "You make people feel like they're being taken seriously. That's different from warmth, but it's not lesser." He turned his pen over in his hand. "Most people don't feel significant because they feel happy. They feel significant because someone's actually paying attention to them. Not performing attention, actually paying it." Victoria didn't respond immediately. He could see her absorbing it, not rejecting it, not accepting it with the quick gratitude of a compliment received, but actually sitting with it, turning it over, checking its weight. "You're good at that," she said finally. "Paying attention." "Occupational requirement." "Not only occupational." He didn't answer that. She didn't push it. They worked for the rest of the ride, together, mostly, switching between her screen and his notebook, building the presentation framework into something that was starting to feel genuinely right. Not polished yet, not finished, but structurally sound in the way that good work felt from the inside when you were in it. Grand Central was its usual organized chaos, and they emerged from the Acela onto the platform into the particular kind of noise that New York made, purposeful, layered, entirely indifferent to the people moving through it. Nathan fell into pace beside Victoria as they moved toward the exit, both of them carrying bags, neither of them talking, and there was something strange and unremarkable about walking beside her outside a professional context, on a platform in a train station, just two people who had been working across a table for 2.5 hours and now needed to find a cab. "The hotel's on 53rd, Victoria said, checking her phone. "My assistant booked the car." "I'll take a cab." She looked at him. "We're going to the same place." "I know." A pause. "Nathan, get in the car." He got in the car. It was a standard black sedan, and the driver knew where he was going, and New York slid past the windows in its mid-morning version. Delivery trucks, midtown pedestrians, the particular light that the city generated between buildings on a clear spring day that managed to be different from light anywhere else. "The prep sessions," Nathan said. "How many do you want before Thursday?" "2, tonight and Wednesday morning." "I'll need the final Beaumont research files before tonight." "You'll have them by 2. "The board's expecting a pre-read by tomorrow?" "Tomorrow noon. I'll handle the executive summary. You handle the strategy narrative." "Fine." They were quiet for a moment. The car moved. Outside, a delivery person on a bike threaded through stopped traffic with the confidence of someone who had done it 10,000 times and stopped being afraid of it around the 8,000th. "The thing you said," Victoria said, "on the train, about making people feel significant. What about it? Do you actually believe that? About me?" He turned from the window. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking forward, which was the only tell that the question cost her something. "I don't say things I don't believe," Nathan said. "That should be fairly clear by this point." She nodded once, went back to her phone. But something had settled in her posture. Not relaxed exactly, but less held, like a door that hadn't been opened but was now slightly less locked. The hotel was understated in the way that very expensive hotels sometimes were. No grand lobby theater, just quality that announced itself through material and proportion. Victoria checked them in with the quick efficiency of someone who spent a third of their life in hotels and had removed all friction from the process. Nathan checked in separately, which she didn't comment on, and neither did he. His room was on the 14th floor. He dropped his bag, changed his shirt, washed his face, and stood at the window for a moment looking at the city's midday version of itself. All that vertical geometry, all that accumulated effort and ambition and compromise pressed upward against a blue April sky. He checked his phone. A text from Sophie, sent through his mother's phone with the distinctive grammar of someone who had gotten hold of a device with some adult supervision. "Hi, Dad, we are making cookies. Grandma says I can put in extra chocolate chips. Bye." He laughed, alone in a hotel room in New York, and typed back, "Put in the extra chips. Tell Grandma I said it's fine." Then, "Be good. I'll call tonight." Pocketed the phone, opened his laptop, found the first Beaumont file Victoria had sent, which had arrived at 1:58, 2 minutes before her promised 2 o'clock. He started reading. By the time the evening session began, 6 o'clock, the small conference room Victoria's assistant had reserved on the second floor. Nathan had read everything twice and made enough notes to cover 4 pages. He arrived 2 minutes early and found Victoria already there, which wasn't surprising, and which he'd stopped commenting on because the commentary hadn't changed anything. She'd ordered coffee and sandwiches from somewhere, which were sitting on the table in the specific practical way of someone who had decided that working was the point, and eating was a logistical necessity attached to it. "The Beaumont files," Nathan said, setting his notebook on the table. "There's a section missing." She looked up. "Which section?" "The daughter? Clara Beaumont. She's been running operations for the past 3 years, but there's almost nothing on her in the research. She doesn't give interviews. Then we need to find out what we can from other sources, because if Thomas Beaumont signs off but Clara doesn't, this deal doesn't survive the transition. She's the continuity. He sat down. She's the reason the properties will either stay what they are or stop being what they are. Victoria looked at him with the expression he'd started to recognize as the one where she'd already thought of something, but was reassessing it in light of new framing. You think we need to present to her separately, she said. I think we need to present to her without her knowing that's what we're doing. A pause. That's ethically complicated. Not if we're genuinely addressing her concerns rather than managing them. There's a difference between manipulation and anticipation. You use that distinction frequently. It's a useful distinction. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. Then, you're right about Clara. I should have caught that. You caught Thomas Beaumont's 1991 interview at midnight on a Saturday. Give yourself some credit. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like the physical expression of considering whether a smile was warranted. Let's build the Clara section, she said. They worked through the evening, and somewhere around 8:30, the sandwiches disappeared without either of them having noticed they were eating, and the coffee was replaced by something a hotel employee brought in without being asked, which was either excellent service or a sign that they'd been in this room long enough that someone had taken pity on them. At 10:15, Nathan leaned back in his chair and looked at the presentation on Victoria's screen. It was good. Genuinely, structurally, emotionally good. The kind of good that he recognized from the inside, where the argument held and the feeling held, and the two of them had pushed each other into a third thing that neither would have reached without the other. It happened occasionally in his work, this particular quality of rightness. He'd learned not to take it for granted. The opening, he said. Read it again. She read it. Her own voice in the quiet room, calm, precise, with the particular quality of someone who meant what they were saying and had stopped needing to perform the meaning. When she finished, she looked up. It's right, Nathan said. She didn't say I know the way she sometimes did. She just nodded, looking at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, and he understood from the way she was looking at it that the presentation meant something to her beyond the deal. Your father, Nathan said quietly. Would he have liked this approach? She looked at him. The question had landed somewhere real. He could see it. Not painfully, not intrusively, just accurately. The way something true landed when it found the right moment. Yes, she said. He would have. She closed the laptop, started gathering her notes. They rode the elevator in silence, 14th floor for Nathan, 17th for Victoria. He got out first, and he was halfway down the hall when she said his name. He turned. She was standing in the elevator, one hand on the door to hold it. The thing you said in the meeting last week, she said. The joke. Victoria, see, I'm not... She stopped. Started again. I know it was a joke. I know my answer was more than I intended. I'm not... She looked at the elevator door, then back at him. I just want you to know that what I said was true. Not the way I said it, but the fact of it. He looked at her from the hallway. The elevator light was warm on her face. She looked, in this moment, like neither the executive board's Victoria nor the professional rival's Victoria, but like a person who had said something true and was standing in the aftermath of it, not sure what came next. I know, he said. The elevator doors closed. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the building settle around him, to the muffled sound of New York 14 floors below, to the specific quality of a Tuesday night in a hotel where nothing had happened and something had shifted, and the distance between those two facts was the whole story. Then he went to his room, called Sophie. She told him about the cookies, extra chips, as requested, and yes, Grandma had complained about the quantity and made them anyway, which was, Sophie reported, very Grandma. He told her he'd be back Thursday. She said okay, and that she'd saved him 2 cookies, 1 chocolate chip and 1 just regular, and that he should not eat them for breakfast, even though he sometimes did that. I would never, he said. Dad. I'm serious. Dad. He laughed. She laughed. They said goodnight. He put the phone down on the nightstand, lay back on the hotel bed in the dark, and stared at the ceiling of a room in New York where the city made its constant low sound outside, and thought about a woman on the 17th floor who had said a true thing in an elevator doorway and hadn't looked away while she said it. He thought about that for a long time. Wednesday morning arrived the way mornings do in New York hotels. Not gently, the city having no particular interest in your sleep schedule, but with a kind of blunt insistence that the day had started whether you were ready for it or not. Nathan was up at 6. Not because he'd slept well. He hadn't, not badly either, just in the shallow, fragmented way of sleeping in a room that wasn't his, in a bed that was technically comfortable but that his body hadn't agreed to trust yet, but because lying there past 6 felt like a concession he wasn't willing to make. He showered, made the terrible in-room coffee because the other option was waiting, and waiting required a stillness he didn't currently have access to. Opened his laptop and read through the presentation twice, looking for the places where it could break. Every presentation had them. The seams, the moments where the logic held on paper but could come apart under the specific pressure of a live room, a skeptical audience, a question that went somewhere the framework hadn't anticipated. Finding them in advance was most of the job. Patching them was the rest. He found 2. Sent Victoria a note at 6:47 outlining both. She replied at 6:49. I see them. The second one is worse than you think. Conference room at 8. He was there at 7:55. She arrived at 7:58, which he'd stopped thinking of as almost late and had started understanding as its own kind of precision. She didn't arrive early because early was waiting, and waiting was time she could be using. She had a better coffee than him. He noticed this immediately. Where did you get that? He said. There's a place 2 blocks south that opens at 6:30. You walk 2 blocks at 6:30 in the morning for coffee. I walked 2 blocks at 6:15. The coffee was ready at 6:30. She sat down, opened her laptop. The second seam, the transition from the cultural stewardship argument to the financial structure, it's abrupt. I know. The problem is the financial structure is complicated enough that it needs its own section. But if we give it its own section, it breaks the emotional through line. So we can't give it its own section. Which means we need to find a way to fold the financial case into the stewardship narrative without it feeling like we're hiding the numbers inside a feel-good story. Victoria looked at the screen. The Beaumont family isn't naive. They've had other offers. They know what acquisition structures look like. Right, so we don't simplify the numbers, we contextualize them. Nathan pulled his notebook across the table. What if the financial section opens with Thomas Beaumont's own language? The stuff from the 2011 interview where he talks about what made him turn down the Carlyle Group offer. He says it wasn't the money. He says it was that Carlyle came in and showed him a spreadsheet before they showed him that they understood his properties. Victoria was quiet, looking at her screen. We reverse the Carlyle mistake, Nathan continued. We show them we understand the properties first. That's everything up to the financial section. Then we show them the structure, and by that point the numbers aren't a cold object. They're the expression of a set of values we've already established. The risk, Victoria said, is that it looks like we're softening them up before the hard ask. That's always the risk. The question is whether Thomas Beaumont is the kind of person who sees thoughtful framing as manipulation or as respect. He's the kind of person who turned down $400 million because he didn't feel heard, Victoria said, which tells me he's exquisitely sensitive to the difference. Then we have to be honest about it. In the room. If it comes up, we say directly, the reason we structured it this way is because we believe the financial case is stronger when it's understood in context, not in isolation. We're not hiding the numbers. We're giving them a home. Victoria looked at him. Giving them a home, she repeated. Too much? No. She turned back to the screen. It's exactly right. Write it down before you lose it. He wrote it down. They worked through the seams for the next 90 minutes, and it had that same quality as the Tuesday evening session. The two of them moving around the problem from different angles, testing, pushing, occasionally stepping on each other and backing off and trying again. There was a moment, somewhere around 9:30, when they were both looking at the same section of the presentation on her screen, and Nathan reached across to point at a specific line, and their hands came within 3 inches of each other on the table, and neither of them moved for a second. And then both of them did, without acknowledging that either of them had noticed. The Wednesday afternoon was preparatory in the practical sense, a run-through of the full presentation, timed, which came in at 47 minutes, which was 3 minutes over the 44 they'd been told they had, which meant cuts. Cutting is always harder than building. Building is generative. You're adding, finding, making something out of nothing. Cutting requires deciding what matters least. And when everything in the room has been argued for and refined, deciding what matters least is its own kind of argument. They cut the company history section from 8 minutes to 4. Nathan objected to losing the founding narrative. Victoria said the Beaumonts didn't need to know where Ashcroft started. They needed to know where it was going. Nathan said you can't understand where something is going without knowing where it came from. Victoria said that was a philosophy of history, not a presentation strategy. They argued about it for 11 minutes, which was 7 minutes longer than just cutting the section would have taken, and eventually landed on a compromise that was 2 minutes and 40 seconds and contained what Nathan privately thought was the essential point and what Victoria privately thought was adequate. Neither of them said this out loud. They were learning when to stop. At 5 o'clock, Victoria's phone rang. She looked at the screen and something changed in her face. Not visibly dramatic, just a small shift, the kind that happened when something professional became personal in a way you hadn't prepared for. "I need to take this," she said, and stood up and walked to the far side of the room. Nathan didn't listen. He went back to his notes, giving her the fiction of privacy in a small conference room, which was the best available option and which she would do the same for him, he knew, because she already had on the Wednesday video call when Sophie had apparently gotten hold of his phone and called him back. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Victoria came back to the table, her posture had the quality of something that had been carefully reassembled. "My father," she said, sitting down. "He's fine," she added immediately, answering the question before he could ask it. "He calls on Wednesdays. She paused. "He likes to check in on the major deals." "You told him about the Meridian acquisition?" "He reads the trade press." Something in her voice was dry, but not bitter. "He had opinions about the approach." "What kind of opinions?" She looked at the table for a moment. "He thinks I should have gone in earlier, made a relationship with Thomas Beaumont before we were in acquisition mode. He says the deal would be easier if we weren't strangers." "He's probably right." She looked up at him. "He's right about the principle," Nathan said. "The application is hindsight. You couldn't have known 2 years ago that Beaumont would be ready to sell now." "No." She picked up her pen, put it down. "He wasn't criticizing. He was being helpful. He just has a particular way of being helpful that sounds like criticism when you're already worried about something." Nathan thought about his mother and the whiteboard and the car with the scratch on it and the patient, merciless clarity of being truly known by someone. "Yeah," he said. "I know how that goes." She looked at him with an expression that was more open than her usual register. Tired, maybe, or just less guarded than she'd intended to be. "He was the one who told me to hire you," she said. Nathan stopped. "What?" 8 months ago, when the board was discussing the campaign strategy. I had 2 other firms under consideration. My father read their proposals and yours and told me yours was the only one that understood what we were building rather than what we had. She picked up the pen again, turned it over. "I agreed with him, but I wanted you to know it wasn't only my decision." "Why are you telling me this now?" She seemed to consider the question genuinely. "Because he just reminded me that he told me so, and I didn't want to be the only person in this room carrying that information." Nathan looked at her. "You're remarkably strange," he said. "I know." She opened her laptop. 44 minutes. "Let's run it again." They ran it again. It came in at 43:45 and the cuts held and the financial transition worked the way they'd wanted it to. And the Clara Beaumont section, which they'd built from inference and public records, and the one profile that mentioned her in passing as the quiet engine behind Meridian's operational consistency, landed exactly where it needed to. When they finished the second run-through, the room had gone dark outside the windows in the way that New York went dark, which was less dark than anywhere else because the city generated its own permanent ambient light. Nathan looked at the window for a moment and felt the particular satisfaction of work that was ready. Not perfect, there was no such thing, but ready. complete in the way that meant whatever happened in the room tomorrow was up to the room. "We're good," he said. Victoria nodded. She looked tired, not exhausted, but like someone who had spent the past 48 hours at a sustained level of focus and was now in the moment just before the adrenaline acknowledged it. "Dinner," she said. "There's a place nearby. Good food, quiet. No one will want to talk to us about anything. Is that an invitation or a scheduling announcement?" She looked at him. "Both." The restaurant was on a side street, Mouts. Narrow, not loud, the kind of place that had been there long enough to stop trying to prove itself. They were seated in a corner booth, which Nathan suspected was an accidental, and they ordered without extensive deliberation, because neither of them had the bandwidth for extensive deliberation, and because the menu was short enough to make the decision simple. For the first 10 minutes, they didn't talk about work. This was unusual. Most of their shared time in the last 8 months had been structured around a professional purpose, and the moments between the purposes had been brief and transitional. But tonight there was no next session, no document to return to, no section left to revise. The work was done. What was left was the dinner and each other and the absence of an agenda. Victoria drank her wine with the expression of someone who hadn't properly tasted anything since Tuesday morning. "Tell me something," Nathan said. She looked up. "That's vague. Tell me something that has nothing to do with the Meridian acquisition, or the Ashcroft Group, or the presentation tomorrow." A pause. She seemed to find the request genuinely unusual, which itself told him something. "I've been learning to play piano," she said. "Very badly, since January." He hadn't expected that. "Why piano?" "Because I spend most of my time being competent at things, and I wanted to spend some time being bad at something, intentionally." She looked at her glass. "My teacher is 70 years old and has no patience for excuses, and once told me that I held tension in my hands the way a person who had never been allowed to be wrong held tension in their hands." That's uncomfortably perceptive. She's a terrifyingly perceptive woman. A small silence. "I go every Thursday evening. I have been for 4 months. I can play one piece, slowly, with mistakes." "Which piece?" she told him. It was a Chopin nocturne, the one in E-flat major, which Nathan knew only because his ex-wife had loved it and used to play it from her phone while she worked, a memory that arrived and passed quickly, the way memories did when they were old enough to have lost their edges. "Why that one?" he asked. "It doesn't sound like showing off," she said. "Most piano pieces, even simple ones, sound like the person is trying to demonstrate something. That one just sounds like someone feeling something, privately." She picked up her fork, which appealed to me. Nathan looked at her across the table. The restaurant light was warm and she was looking at her plate, and he thought about the Saturday midnight timestamps and the piano teacher and the elevator, and "I just want you to know that what I said was true." And he thought about the way she'd said the word "I've been trying to find" for 3 days when he'd sent her stewardship at 1:43 in the morning, and he thought about 8 months of friction that had never once felt like indifference, not for a single meeting, not for a single exchange. "The joke I made," he said, "in the Boylston Street meeting." She looked up. "I want to be honest about it," he said. "It wasn't entirely a joke." The table between them went quiet in a particular way. "I know," she said. "I said it because I was deflecting something I didn't know how to say directly. Which is," he stopped, "which is not how I usually operate, and I don't love that it happened in a room full of your colleagues. My colleagues have survived worse. That's not the point." "No." She put down her fork. "The point is that you said something true in the wrong register, and I answered it in the wrong register, and we've both been carrying that since." "Yeah." She was looking at him with the directness that was just how she looked at things. No performance of eye contact, just attention, genuine and slightly unnerving. "What did you mean to say?" she asked. "If you'd said it directly." He picked up his glass, put it down. "That you're the most demanding person I've ever worked with, and also the most worth it. That I've been professionally frustrated with you approximately once a week for 8 months, and I've never once wanted to stop." He looked at the table. "That the part about living with your impossible standards wasn't actually the punchline. It was the part I was trying not to say." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Victoria didn't look away. She also didn't fill the silence, which he'd come to understand was its own kind of courage from someone for whom silence in professional context was a tool, carefully deployed. This silence was different. She was sitting in it, not using it. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. Her voice was careful, but not careful in the managed professional way. Careful like someone walking on ground they hadn't walked on before and paying attention to where they put their feet. "I'm good at a lot of things. This specific, I'm not good at it." "Neither am I," Nathan said. "I haven't been good at it since Sophie was born. I kind of stopped trying." "Why?" "Because it was easier to be a father and a professional than to be both of those things, and also someone who wanted something for himself." He said it simply, the way you said something when you'd finally admitted it to yourself enough times that the words had stopped feeling dangerous. And because Sophie deserved someone who was fully present, and I didn't know how to be fully present for more than one person at a time. "And now?" He looked at her. "I'm having dinner with you in New York, and I haven't checked my phone in 40 minutes, which is... That's not nothing." Something moved across her face that he hadn't seen before. Not the almost smile, not the professional assessment, not the careful deliberation. Something quieter, unguarded in a way that looked like it had surprised her. "My last relationship," she said, "ended because the person I was with told me I made him feel irrelevant." She said it without self-pity, just fact. "He said I was always somewhere else, always planning the next thing, evaluating the current thing, never just..." She stopped. "Never just there." "Were you?" "Yes." No hesitation. "I was. I'm not sure I know how to be otherwise." "You've been here for this entire conversation." She paused, seemed to actually register this. "The piano teacher," Nathan said. "She told you something true. You kept going back. You're there every Thursday." He looked at her. "You know how to be present. You just have to decide something's worth it first." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "You're very good at finding the center of something," she said softly. Not as a deflection, as an acknowledgement. "Occupational requirement," he said, the same answer he'd given on the train. "Not only occupational," she said, the same response, and this time neither of them looked away. They finished dinner, walked back to the hotel through the Wednesday evening version of the city, which was less frenetic than the weekend and more human than the morning, just people moving through a place they lived in, doing the things that constituted a life. Nathan's hands were in his pockets. Victoria was 2 feet to his left, their pace matched without discussion. At one point she said, "Sophie, does she know you're here?" "She knows I'm in New York for work. She wanted to know if I'd see the Statue of Liberty." "Did you tell her it's not really visible from Midtown?" "I told her I'd try." He glanced over. "She also told me to bring her a pretzel from a street cart. She's very specific about New York food despite never having been here." "She sounds very specific in general." "She has opinions, strong ones, about lunch and dogs and whether the sun in her drawings should have a face." He paused. "She has a drawing on her nightstand. A house, 2 figures. She put a 3rd figure in last week, smaller than me, bigger than her." He was quiet for a moment. "She drew it a woman." Victoria didn't say anything. They walked. "Kids see things," Nathan said. "Or they draw things. I don't know if it's the same." "Maybe it is," Victoria said. The hotel lobby was quiet at this hour. They rode up in the elevator together. Different floors, the same car. 14 for Nathan, 17 for Victoria. The floors ascended in silence, but a different silence now. One that had been filled and emptied and filled again in the course of one evening and was now just the space between 2 people who had said true things and were sitting with the fact of having said them. At 14, the doors opened. Nathan stepped out, turned back. She was looking at him from inside the elevator with the expression he didn't have a name for yet. The open one. The one that had surprised her as much as it surprised him. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The doors closed. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Down the corridor, a room service cart sat outside a door, evidence of someone else's evening, someone else's ordinary life inside an extraordinary city. The carpet was the generic hotel pattern that no one designed to be noticed, and that he had now noticed probably 100 times in 100 corridors in 100 hotels, always moving through, always arriving or departing, never quite. He went to his room. Did not call Sophie because it was too late and she was asleep, and because he was not in a state of mind that would have made the call sensible anyway. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while, which was something he almost never did. He was a person who either did things or slept, not a person who sat, and thought about the restaurant, and the piano, and the third figure in Sophie's drawing. He thought about 8 months of friction, and what it had been building toward, the way you only understood the architecture of something once you were standing inside the finished room. He thought about tomorrow. The presentation was scheduled for 10 o'clock in a building on Park Avenue that belonged to a law firm serving as neutral ground for the negotiation. Nathan and Victoria arrived together at 9:15, which gave them 45 minutes in a waiting area that had clearly been designed for exactly this purpose. Comfortable enough to not feel like a punishment, formal enough to remind you what you were here for. Victoria was in a dark suit that Nathan had not seen before, and that managed to be both authoritative and somehow not aggressive, the sartorial equivalent of a firm handshake rather than a locked door. She was looking at her phone. She looked up when he sat down across from her. "How are you?" he asked. "Ready?" A beat. "Nervous?" "You're nervous." "I'm always nervous before something important. I just don't show it." "What does it feel like, from the inside?" She considered this with the same seriousness she gave everything. Like, the presentation is already happening somewhere ahead of me, and I'm trying to catch up to it. That's just anticipation. It's unpleasant. "Yeah," Nathan said. "It is." She looked at him. "Are you nervous?" "Yes. Different flavor." "What flavor?" "The one where I know the work is good, and I'm afraid the room won't see it." He looked at his hands. "The work being good doesn't guarantee anything. Rooms are unpredictable." "This room matters," Victoria said. It wasn't said dramatically, just factually, the way she said things that were true. "I know. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does," Victoria. He leaned forward slightly. "We built something real in there. The Beaumont family has been in this business for 30 years. Thomas Beaumont turned down a $400 million offer because it didn't feel right. He will know the difference between something real and something performed." He held her gaze. "What we built is real. Let the room see it." She looked at him for a long moment. Something settled in her posture. Not confidence exactly, more like the decision to trust the work. "Let's go," she said. Thomas Beaumont was 71 and looked like a man who had spent decades paying attention to people. The specific quality of someone for whom hospitality wasn't a business model, but a genuine orientation toward other human beings. He had silver hair, a handshake that meant something, and eyes that moved around a room the way Nathan's did, cataloging, assessing without hostility. His daughter Clara was 38. She said almost nothing during the introductions. She sat slightly back from the table, her legal pad open, her pen uncapped, watching with the expression of someone who had been in many rooms where people made promises and had developed a finely calibrated instrument for detecting which promises were real. Nathan registered her immediately, looked at Victoria for half a second. She'd registered her too. The Beaumont family's attorneys were present. Victoria's legal team was present. The room had the formal density of a negotiation in its final stages. Everyone knowing their role, everyone measuring their words. Victoria opened. She spoke for 4 minutes without notes. Not the scripted opening they'd rehearsed. Nathan could tell she'd moved off it, was doing something live, something in response to the specific quality of this room. She talked about the first Ashcroft property, briefly. Then she talked about Thomas Beaumont's first property, in the language he'd used to describe it across 15 years of interviews, in a way that made clear she had spent real time understanding what it meant to him. She did not perform emotion. She simply demonstrated that she had paid attention, which was a different thing entirely and vastly more powerful. When she finished the opening, Thomas Beaumont was leaning forward slightly in his chair. Nathan took the strategic presentation. 44 minutes. He stayed within the framework, the cultural stewardship argument, the financial structure contextualized within the values, the Clara section, which he'd built as a natural transition rather than a separate element, framing the operational continuity question in terms of what made the Meridian properties work from the inside rather than the outside. At the 31-minute mark, Clara Beaumont spoke for the first time. "The operational continuity model," she said. Her voice was even, precise, with a quality that reminded Nathan unexpectedly of Victoria. "You're projecting that the property management teams would stay intact for a minimum of 3 years post-acquisition." "Correct," Nathan said. "What happens at 3 years?" "Evaluation. Individual basis. The model assumes that by 3 years, the cultural integration is either working or it isn't, and the personnel decisions reflect that reality rather than a preset timeline." "That's honest," she said. "We tried to be." She looked at him. Then she looked at her legal pad, made a note, said nothing else. But her father, Nathan noticed, watched this exchange with the expression of a man who had just seen something that mattered to him. The presentation finished. Victoria answered questions for 20 minutes, calm, specific, never defensive, which Nathan knew was harder than it looked, which was why he'd learned to watch for it. The financial questions came from the attorneys, and she handled them with precision. The philosophical questions came from Thomas Beaumont, and she handled them with something closer to honesty than most people brought to a negotiation room. At 1:45, Thomas Beaumont said he would need the weekend to discuss with his family and attorneys, which was expected, which was what he had said after every previous meeting in this process, which meant nothing definitive and everything possible. They shook hands. The room dispersed. In the elevator going down, Victoria and Nathan stood side by side. The building's lobby reflected back at them in the polished metal doors. Two people in good suits, composed, professional, giving nothing away to the lobby cameras. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. Nathan turned to her. "You went off the opening," he said. "I know. It was better." She looked at him, and in the polished metal of the closing elevator doors behind her, Nathan caught their reflection for a fraction of a second. Two people standing very close together in a lobby, and the reflection didn't show any of the distance that the room upstairs had required them to maintain. It just showed two people standing close together, and then the doors finished closing, and the reflection was gone. "Claire's note," Victoria said. "When she wrote it down, did you see her father?" "I saw him." "He trusts her judgment." "Yes." "If she's with us, he'll sign." "Yes." Nathan looked at her. "I think she's with us." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she exhaled, a real exhale, not the controlled professional kind, but the kind that happened when you'd been holding something for a long time and finally put it down. "Come on," she said. "I need actual coffee, and I need to sit somewhere that isn't a negotiation room." They found a place 2 blocks from the building, unremarkable, the kind of coffee shop that existed as infrastructure rather than destination. Tables by the window, decent light, nobody looking at them. They got coffee and didn't talk about the presentation for a while, which required a specific kind of restraint and which both of them managed. Outside the window, Park Avenue moved in its midday version. Cabs, people, the occasional absurdity of a horse-drawn carriage that had wandered up from Central Park and was managing traffic with the serenity of something that had opted out of urgency. "If they sign," Victoria said, not looking away from the window, "this is the largest acquisition in the company's history." "I know. My father started the company with 1 property. My grandfather started it with nothing." She was quiet. "This deal makes us something different, not bigger, different." "Is that what you want?" She turned from the window. "It's what I've been building toward." "That's not the same thing." A pause. She looked at him with the expression that was becoming familiar to him, the one where she was deciding how honest to be and then choosing more honest than less. "I don't know if those two things have ever been the same for me," she said. "What I'm building toward and what I want. I'm not sure I've spent very much time on the second question." "What do you want?" he asked. The coffee shop made its ambient sounds around them. Someone's order being called. The specific music of a place that wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "I want to stop feeling like the people around me are proud of what I've built and can't quite see me," she said. "I want—" She stopped. Started again. "I want someone in the room who's looking at me, not the company, not the title, not the result." Her voice was even, but the evenness was the controlled kind, the kind that meant something was being held carefully. I want to be in a room with someone and have them look at me the way you look at me when I say something that's actually true, and not have to wonder whether they're seeing the position or the person. The silence after that was the kind that didn't need to be filled. Nathan set down his coffee cup, very carefully. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I see the person." She didn't say anything, but something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, not in the ways that got described in the kinds of stories where people transformed in important moments. Just a small shift, like a door opening an inch, like something that had been closed for a long time, reconsidering. "I know," she said quietly. I know." They sat there for a while longer in the unremarkable coffee shop on Park Avenue while the city moved outside and the coffee cooled and neither of them reached for their phones, which was its own kind of thing. Two people choosing to stay inside a moment rather than escape it, because the moment, for once, was somewhere they both wanted to be. At 3 o'clock, Nathan's phone rang. He looked at the screen, his mother, and looked at Victoria, and she gestured with her chin, "Take it." He picked up. "Your daughter," his mother said, "has decided she would like to FaceTime you from my phone, and she is not accepting alternatives." He could hear Sophie in the background demanding the phone with the particular energy of a 6-year-old who had decided something. "Put her on," Nathan said. Sophie's face appeared on the screen, slightly too close to the camera, her hair doing the thing it did when she'd been running around without a hair tie. "Dad," she said, with the urgency of breaking news, "there's a dog in the neighbor's yard." "Hi, Soph." "It's brown and white, and it keeps looking at me through the fence." "What kind of dog?" "A regular dog. Can I name it?" "It's not your dog." "But I could call it something in my head." "Sure, yeah, you can call it something in your head." Sophie's face did the thing it did when she was satisfied. Then she looked past the phone camera with the instinct of a child who was aware of her audience. "Dad, who's that?" Nathan adjusted the phone slightly, which he realized too late had adjusted it toward Victoria rather than away from her. Victoria, for her part, appeared in the background of the frame with the specific expression of a person who had not expected to suddenly be part of a FaceTime call with a 6-year-old and was rapidly assessing the situation. "That's Victoria," Nathan said. We're working together." Sophie stared at the screen for a moment. "Hi, Victoria," she said. Victoria leaned toward the phone slightly. "Hi," she said. Her voice had a different quality than Nathan had ever heard in it. Uncertain, but not professionally uncertain, humanly uncertain, like someone who had been handed something fragile and was figuring out how to hold it. "Do you live in New York?" Sophie asked. "No, I live in Boston." "We live in Boston too," Sophie said, as if this were remarkable. "Dad says you're his work person." "His work person," Victoria repeated. "Yeah." Sophie turned back to the camera. "Dad, the dog is looking at me again." "Then go look back at it." "Okay, bye." She waved. Then she looked past the camera again. "Bye, Victoria." "Bye," Victoria said. The call ended. Nathan put his phone face down on the table and looked at it for a second. When he looked up, Victoria was looking at him with the expression he didn't have a name for yet, the open one, but it was fuller now than it had been in the elevator doorway Tuesday night, fuller than it had been across the restaurant table the night before. "Your work person," she said. "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be." She looked at her coffee. "She has your directness." "She has it worse," Nathan said. "She has no filter yet. She's working on it." "Don't let her work too hard on it." A pause. "Filters are overrated." Nathan looked at her. She was looking at her coffee, and her expression was the kind that people had when they'd surprised themselves with what they'd said and were deciding whether to take it back. She didn't take it back. Outside, the city maintained its afternoon posture, purposeful, dense, entirely indifferent to the specific weight of any given conversation happening within it. But inside the coffee shop on Park Avenue, two people sat with their cooling coffees and the particular feeling of having arrived somewhere that had been a long time coming. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because sometimes the thing that needed saying had already been said, and what was left was just the presence, the choosing to stay, the simple and significant fact of being there. The call came on a Friday. Nathan was in his car outside a sandwich place on Cambridge Street, engine running, waiting for a parking spot that someone had been edging toward for 3 minutes with the indecision of a person who hadn't fully committed to leaving, when his phone rang through the speakers and Marcus Webb's name appeared on the dash screen. He picked up. "They signed," Marcus said. Nathan sat with that for a second. Outside, the person in the parking spot made their decision and pulled out, and Nathan pulled in. And the ordinary machinery of a Friday afternoon continued around him, while something large and significant settled into place in his chest. "When?" he asked. 20 minutes ago. Thomas Beaumont called Victoria directly. The attorneys are handling the paperwork. It's done." Marcus paused, and Nathan could hear in the pause the particular quality of someone who had been in this business long enough to understand what done meant. "Nathan, this is the largest acquisition in the company's history, and the board knows it wouldn't have happened without the presentation." "It wouldn't have happened without Victoria's preparation," Nathan said. "Sure. And your framework, and whatever you two are doing in New York that made the Beaumont family trust us." Another pause. "Diane Cho said Clara Beaumont called her office this morning, asked specific questions about the operational continuity model, the stuff you put together. Clara's the one who matters long term." "I know. Victoria knows. The board knows." Marcus had the energy of a man who had been holding good news for 20 minutes and was genuinely relieved to be releasing it. "There's a celebration dinner Monday. Victoria's organizing. You're expected." "I'll be there." He hung up, sat in the parked car for a moment longer than necessary. Through the windshield, Cambridge Street did its Friday afternoon thing, people moving with the specific energy of a city approaching the weekend, a little looser than Tuesday, a little more willing to take their time. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. They signed. "You should know." 3 words that weren't thank you and weren't congratulations and weren't any of the professional formulations he might have expected, just 3 words that assumed he'd want to know immediately, which was its own kind of thing. He typed back, "I know." Marcus called. "How do you feel?" The response took 4 minutes, which for Victoria was a long time. When it came, it was, "Like I need to sit down," which I'm doing. "In my office. Don't tell anyone." He smiled, typed, "Your secret." He got his sandwich, drove back to his office, spent the afternoon on other accounts, other clients, the ordinary work of a professional life that had been partially on hold while New York consumed his attention. By 5 o'clock, he had cleared most of the backlog, answered 17 emails, and had a conversation with his Cambridge restaurant client that resulted in a compromise about the rebranding timeline that nobody loved but that everyone could live with, which was most of what compromise actually was. At 5:15, Sophie's after-school program ended. His mother picked her up on Fridays. By 6:30, she would be home, demanding to know what was for dinner and whether there was any update on the situation with the neighbor's dog, which had apparently become a continuing story. He left his office at 5:50, stopped at the grocery store, bought the things Sophie liked, the green grapes, the specific brand of yogurt that had to have the cartoon character on the lid, or it was the wrong one, the pasta she'd eat without negotiation, and drove home through the Friday traffic, which was bad in the Boston way that traffic was bad on Fridays, everyone collectively deciding to leave at the same time and then surprised by the consequences. His mother's car was in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, he could see the light on and the specific shape of dinner being made. He sat in the car for just a moment, not like the night of the boardroom joke, not unsettled, just pausing, taking stock. The deal was done. The work was real. And somewhere across the city, Victoria Ashcroft was sitting in her office feeling something large enough that she needed to be sitting down for it, and trusting him with that information, which was, he had come to understand, not a small thing from her. He got out of the car, took the groceries inside. Sophie hit him in the midsection at approximately the speed and force of a small person who had been waiting since 3 o'clock. She was telling him about the dog before he'd finished hugging her. It had a name, apparently, which the neighbors had shared through the fence, and the name was Biscuit, which Sophie found reasonable, and it was a beagle, and she had given it a piece of her granola bar through the fence, which his mother reported from the stove with the tone of someone who had considered stopping this and decided it wasn't worth the fight. "You can't feed other people's dogs," Nathan said, without much conviction. "It was just a small piece." "Still, it liked it." "Sophie, I didn't feed it all of it." She held up her hands approximately 6 inches apart. "This much." He looked at her. She looked at him. They both understood that this particular negotiation was over. "Set the table," he said. She set the table. His mother made pasta, the real kind, not from a box, which Sophie ate with the enthusiasm she reserved for food she'd had no part in preparing and therefore found more appealing. Dinner was the ordinary kind. Sophie talking, his mother listening with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted to know about Biscuit and the granola bar and the geography class where they'd done a project on rivers, and Nathan at the end of the table eating his pasta and listening and feeling the particular texture of a life that was full in the way that full lives were, not balanced. Balance was a myth, he'd decided long ago, but present, dense with things that mattered. After Sophie was in bed, his mother poured herself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table with the specific quality of a woman who had been waiting for the household to quiet down before she said what she intended to say. Nathan refilled his own coffee and sat across from her. "Go ahead," he said. "I haven't said anything." "You're about to." She looked at him over her mug. "How was New York?" "Good. Productive." "And how is Victoria Ashcroft?" He looked at his coffee cup. "She's good." "The deal went through." "Yes." "So the presentation worked?" "Yes." His mother was quiet for a moment with the patience of a woman who had learned that silence sometimes extracted more than questions. Nathan had inherited this technique and used it professionally, which meant he recognized it when it was being used on him and was nevertheless not immune to it. "Something's different," his mother said. "Not bad. Just different." "Mom, I'm just noting." "I know you're just noting. You've been lighter since New York. And I don't mean happy because you're usually happy, but lighter, like something stopped sitting on you." She picked up her mug. "So I'm asking." Nathan looked at the kitchen window. Outside, the Somerville night was its ordinary self. Porch lights, the distant sound of a neighbor's television, the particular domestic quiet of a Friday. "I don't know what it is yet," he said honestly. "Something is—" He stopped. "Something is being figured out. I don't have more than that right now." His mother nodded. "Does she know about Jess?" The name landed the way it sometimes still did. Not painfully, that was years ago, but with a weight, an awareness of what it carried. "No," Nathan said. "Are you going to tell her?" "If it becomes relevant." "Nathan." His mother set her mug down. "A woman you co-parent with dying when your daughter is 2 years old is not something that becomes relevant. It's something you tell people who are going to be in your life." "I know." "It explains things." "I know, Mom." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been protecting Sophie since she was born. It's a good instinct. But sometimes protection becomes the only mode you have, and then you start protecting yourself when you don't need to." He didn't answer. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right in the specific way that required sitting with rather than responding to. "She sounds like someone who's protected herself too," his mother said. "Just differently." Nathan looked at her. "You've never met her." "No, but I know you, and the way you talk about someone tells me things about them." She stood up, took her mug to the sink. "Good night, sweetheart. The deal sounds important. I'm glad it worked." She went to bed. Nathan stayed at the kitchen table for a while longer in the quiet of the house, with the coffee and the particular weight of what his mother had said and hadn't said, and what he'd said and hadn't, the whole conversation sitting in the kitchen around him like furniture. Jess. Jessica Mercer, née Callahan, who had been 28 years old and had died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday in March when Sophie was 22 months old, and who had, in the 4 years they'd been together before that, been the clearest evidence Nathan had that he was capable of loving someone completely and losing that completely and surviving it anyway. He didn't talk about her much, not because the grief was still acute. Time had done what time does, converted the sharp thing into something with softer edges, present but not cutting, but because telling the story required a person to be ready for what the story changed, how they looked at him, what they thought the story meant about who he was now. Most people, when they heard it, looked at him with a compassion that shifted something in the room, changed the professional register into something more careful, and more careful always felt a little like being held slightly away from things. He didn't want to be held away from things. Not anymore. The Monday dinner was at a restaurant in the South End that Victoria had chosen with the same deliberate understatement she brought to everything. Not the kind of place that made a statement by being expensive, but the kind that made a statement by being exactly right. Good food, reasonable noise level, a private room in the back that fit 12 people without being cavernous. The Ashcroft senior team was there. Marcus Webb arrived with more energy than usual and immediately ordered a bottle of champagne that he acknowledged was premature but ordered anyway. Diane Cho was in a better mood than Nathan had ever seen her, the version of her that existed when things had gone well, and she wasn't managing the consequences of things having gone badly. Paul Renner laughed at something, and it was actually funny. Victoria was at the end of the table, which became the head of the table, as always. She'd arrived before Nathan. He came in at 7:02. He'd been on the phone with Sophie, who had a book report due Tuesday, and had waited until Monday night to begin it, which was a pattern Nathan recognized as his own and found privately difficult to be stern about. And when he walked into the back room, Victoria was mid-conversation with Diane, but she looked up when he came in, and something in her expression did a small thing that Nathan chose not to read too much into in a room full of her colleagues. "Mercer," Marcus said from across the table. "The man himself. Come sit down." He sat. The dinner proceeded with the specific quality of a professional celebration. Genuine, warm, but measured. The way people celebrated when they were aware that other people were watching how they celebrated. Stories about the acquisition process. Marcus's impression of the legal team's face when the numbers were finalized. Diane providing the legally accurate version of the same story, which was funnier. Nathan was across the table from Victoria, which meant they were in each other's sightlines for the entire dinner, which he'd become practiced at managing and which had become, over the course of New York, and the week following, slightly more complicated to manage than it had previously been. Not badly complicated, just present. At one point, Paul Renner asked Nathan directly, "How did you land the Clara Beaumont angle? That came out of nowhere." It didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of reading the brief carefully and noticing who wasn't in it. The brief didn't mention Clara. Exactly. Paul looked at him. "So you built a whole section of the presentation around someone who wasn't in the brief? Around someone who should have been? The operational continuity of those properties lives with Clara. If we'd walked in without addressing her concerns, we'd have won Thomas and lost the deal anyway. How did you know her concerns without talking to her?" Nathan thought about the research files Victoria had compiled. The profile that mentioned Clara as the quiet engine. The operational decisions traceable to her fingerprints across 15 years of Meridian's internal consistency. "We did our homework," he said. Across the table, Victoria was looking at him with the expression that wasn't quite a smile. The almost one. The one he'd started to think of as specifically his, which was a thought he was not examining too closely in a room full of her senior team. Later, after the dinner ended and the table dispersed with the natural settling of an evening that had reached its conclusion, Nathan found himself standing outside the restaurant with Victoria on a May night in Boston that was warm enough to stand in without a coat, the city doing its evening version of itself, quieter than New York, more horizontal, with the specific quality of a place that knew what it was and wasn't competing with anything. Most of the team had gone. Diane had shared a cab with Paul. Marcus had made a generous speech about the future of the company and then left with the energy of a man with a train to catch. Nathan and Victoria were standing on the sidewalk with the particular absence of an agenda. "Good dinner," he said. "Marcus's toast was 12 minutes long," she said. 11. I counted. She almost smiled. "He means well. He means extremely well, loudly." She looked at the street. A cab went by. A couple walked past talking about something that made one of them laugh, and the laugh carried and then was gone. Boston at 10 o'clock on a Monday, winding down. "The board wants to talk next week," Victoria said, "about the structure going forward. how the Meridian integration gets managed at the strategic level. What does that mean for the campaign work? It means the campaign work becomes larger. There are 5 new properties to integrate into the brand framework. The Charleston launch is still on schedule, but now there's more. She paused. The board will want a formal structure, not just a consulting relationship. Nathan looked at her. What are you saying? She looked at the sidewalk, then at him. I'm saying the board is going to suggest a more formal engagement, embedded strategic role, not just campaign by campaign. And what do you want? The question hung in the May air between them. I want what's good for the company, she said, and then before he could respond, and I want you to stay. She said it the way she said difficult things, directly, without decorative language, but with the awareness of what it costs to say them. Not because the board wants a formal structure, because the work is better when you're in it, and because, she stopped. Because, he said, because the last 3 months have been, she seemed to search for the word and not find the one she wanted. Different from everything before. Different good or different complicated? Both, usually at the same time. He looked at her. On the sidewalk of a Boston street on a Monday night, in the warm May dark, Victoria Ashcroft was standing in front of him looking like someone who had been enormously competent for a very long time and had recently begun to suspect that competence wasn't the whole answer, which was a suspicion he recognized from the inside. There are things you don't know about me, he said. She waited. About my situation? Sophie's mother. He said it looking at her, not at the sidewalk, because she'd told him her true things looking at him, and he owed her the same. She died. Jessica. Sophie was almost 2. It was sudden. He paused. Not for effect, just because the sentence always required a moment after it. I've been alone with Sophie since then. By choice, mostly. It was easier to build a wall around the 2 of us and call it protection. Victoria was very still. I'm not telling you for sympathy, he said. I'm telling you because you told me true things in an elevator and a restaurant and a coffee shop on Park Avenue, and you deserve the same. She looked at him for a long moment. Not with the compassion that shifted the room into something careful, with something different. The attention that meant she was hearing him, actually hearing him, the way she heard everything she decided mattered. How old was she? Victoria asked. 31. A pause. I'm sorry. Yeah. He let the word sit. It was a long time ago, but it shapes things. How you build. What you let in. I understand that, she said quietly. Not the same way, but I understand the architecture of protection. I know you do. They stood there for a moment with the weight of it, which wasn't unbearable, just real. The weight of 2 people who had spent years building careful structures around themselves and were now standing on the outside of those structures, looking at each other. The board meeting, she said finally, not as a deflection but as a return, a way of saying, I heard you and we're still here in the same move. Would you be willing to discuss a formal arrangement? Yes, he said, but I want to talk to you before the board, not after. Why? Because I want to know what you want separate from what the board wants. And because if we're going to work together formally in a way that's, he paused, choosing words, in a way that's different from the last 8 months, I want that decision to be ours, not the board's. She looked at him steadily. And what would make it different? Honesty about what it is, he said. No pretending the professional relationship and the, he gestured vaguely, the other thing, are separable, because they're not. And trying to pretend they are just makes both things worse. Victoria was quiet for a moment. That's a significant thing to acknowledge, she said. I know. In a company context, I know. The board will have Victoria. He said her name the way you said something when you needed the other person to stop the argument and just be in the conversation. I know all the reasons it's complicated. I'm not asking you to solve them tonight. I'm asking you whether you want to. She looked at him. The May night was warm around them. Somewhere nearby a restaurant was closing. The sound of chairs being moved, music being lowered. The end of another Monday. Yes, she said. I want to. He nodded. Okay. Okay, she said. They stood there for another moment, and it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't easy, and it wasn't the kind of thing that resolved itself cleanly, but it was honest. And honesty was something they were both better at than most people, and worse at than they needed to be. And it was a place to start. He got her a cab. She got in. The cab pulled into the Boston traffic. He stood on the sidewalk and watched it go, and then he walked to his car and drove home. And the city was quiet in the way it got on Monday nights when the weekend was gone, and the week hadn't fully started, and there was a space in between where things could be what they actually were. The board meeting was the following Thursday. Nathan had asked for 15 minutes before it started, and Victoria had arranged it, and so at 8:45 in the morning he was sitting across from her in her office. Not the conference room, her actual office, which he'd only been in twice before, and which was, predictably, not what he'd expected. He'd expected it to be austere, minimalist in the aggressive way that powerful people's offices sometimes were, designed to communicate something about their priorities. It wasn't. It was full, not cluttered, but accumulated, the way a space got when someone actually worked in it. Books arranged by subject rather than aesthetics, a collection of architectural prints on one wall, a small framed photograph on the desk that Nathan had once caught a corner of and not looked at directly. A view of Boylston Street through the floor-to-ceiling window that in morning light was actually quite good. On the edge of the desk, a coffee mug that said Boston Public Library and had clearly been used enough times to have earned its place among the expensive things. She was at her desk when he came in, jacket on, ready for the board. She looked, he thought, like someone who had decided something and was carrying that decision cleanly. "Before we go in," Nathan said, sitting down, "I want to be clear about something." "Go ahead." "My recommendation to the board about the formal engagement structure is going to be the same whether or not anything else develops between us. I'm not going to inflate the professional case because of the personal, and I'm not going to hedge the personal because of the professional." He looked at her. "I think the embedded strategic role makes sense for the company. That's a professional opinion. What happens after the board meeting is a separate conversation." Victoria looked at him with the expression she wore when she was seeing something clearly and deciding whether to say so. "You're worried I'll think you're recommending it for the wrong reasons. I'm making sure the air is clean before we go into a room where it matters." "The air has been clean," she said. "Between us. I think it's been clean for a while." "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and picked up her portfolio with the movement of someone transitioning from one context to another, from the office that was hers to the room that was the company's. "Ready?" she said. "Ready." The board meeting was 12 people in the large conference room on the top floor, which had a view of Boston that Nathan registered every time and never got entirely used to. The board members he knew, the familiar faces, the familiar dynamics, the particular atmosphere of a room where significant decisions were made by people who were very aware they were making significant decisions. Victoria opened. She presented the Meridian acquisition in full, the deal structure, the integration timeline, the brand implications, the 5-year projection. It was the best he'd ever heard her present, which was something given that he'd watched her present under pressure in a Park Avenue law firm to a family who was deciding whether to trust her with 30 years of work. The board listened with the attention of people who were hearing what they'd hoped to hear and were recalibrating accordingly. When she got to the strategic structure going forward, she said, "I'm recommending a formal embedded engagement with Nathan Mercer's firm, not project by project, but a defined strategic partnership with access to the full brand portfolio and integration into the senior leadership process for the Meridian properties." She paused. The Meridian deal succeeded because the strategic and cultural arguments were built together. I don't want to lose that architecture going forward. Then she looked at Nathan, just briefly, with the expression that wasn't quite professional and wasn't quite personal, but lived in the space between them that had been building for 8 months. "Nathan," said Richard Ashcroft, Victoria's father, who was still on the board, who Nathan was now seeing in person for the first time, and who had the particular quality of a man who had built something real and knew how to recognize the same in others. "Do you have anything to add?" Nathan looked at him. 67 years old, the same eyes as Victoria, the same quality of attention. The brand architecture for the integrated portfolio needs to hold across 5 properties that each have strong individual identities, Nathan said. That's not a project-level challenge. It requires sustained engagement. Victoria's right that the formal structure makes sense. He paused. I'm also aware that this room knows that Victoria and I have worked closely together over the past several months, and that close working relationships have complications. I want to be direct about the fact that I'm aware of that, and that the professional recommendation I'm making is based on what I believe serves the company. A small silence. Richard Ashcroft looked at his daughter, then back at Nathan. Thank you for saying that directly, he said. Diane Cho, who had been listening with her eyes slightly closed in the way that meant she was paying full attention, opened them. The structure will need clear governance, she said. Deliverables, accountability, defined scope. Agreed, Victoria said. I'll have a proposal to the board by next week. The conflict of interest question, said one of the newer board members, younger, appointed 18 months ago, with the energy of someone who wanted to demonstrate rigor, needs to be addressed formally, not personally. Formally. It will be, Victoria said, and her voice had the quality it had when she was containing something and choosing not to express it. As I said, the proposal will address governance comprehensively. The board moved on. The meeting covered 3 other items: property timelines, a personnel matter, a capital allocation question. And Nathan sat through them with the professional attention of someone who was present and also processing the specific experience of having been direct about a complicated thing in a room full of powerful people and finding that the room had absorbed it. When the meeting ended and the board members filed out with the unhurried efficiency of people who had other meetings to get to, Victoria stayed at the table looking at her notes. Nathan stayed too. The room emptied around them until it was just the 2 of them and the view of Boston through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The younger board member, Nathan said. Harrison, Victoria said. He's thorough. He's right. I know he's right. She looked at her notes. The governance question has to be addressed properly. Not because of optics, because it's the right way to do it. We build it together, Nathan said. The proposal. Same way we built the presentation. She looked up. You want to write the governance framework for your own engagement? I want to build it with you so that it's actually right, which means it has to account for both the professional relationship and, he paused, the thing the board member was careful not to name. The conflict of interest. The relationship, he said. Let's call it what it is. Victoria looked at him across the conference table in the boardroom where 8 months ago he had said something stupid, and she had said 2 true words, and neither of them had been ready for what those 2 words meant. The relationship, she repeated, trying it out, seeing how it sat. Yeah, he said. That's a significant word. It's an accurate one. She looked at the table, then out the window, then back at him. I have a piano lesson tonight, she said. He blinked. Okay. Thursday, 7 o'clock. I've missed the last 2 because of New York and the follow-up work. My teacher called to ask if I was quitting. Are you? No? She said it with a certainty that was slightly disproportionate to the question, which told him it wasn't about the piano. Good, he said. I told her I'd been, she paused, occupied. With work? With several things. She started gathering her notes. Professional again, or partially professional, the mode she moved into when she needed to let a moment exist without extending it beyond what she could manage. The governance proposal. I'll draft something by Wednesday. Send it to me Tuesday night. I'll have notes by morning. You'll be up at 1 in the morning with notes. Probably. She stood. Picked up her portfolio. At the door she paused. Not the elevator pause, not the same texture, but with the same quality of someone deciding something. Nathan, she said. He looked up from his own notes. After the piano lesson tonight. She was looking at him with the direct attention that was just how she looked at things, but warmer than the professional version and more careful than the open elevator version, something in between, something that was becoming its own category. I was going to call you to talk about the governance structure. It doesn't need to be discussed tonight. I know. A pause. I'd still like to call. He looked at her across the empty conference room, In the building on Boylston Street where they'd been having arguments and making things, and slowly, without planning to, building something that was larger than the sum of its professional parts. "Call," he said. She nodded, went to the door, stopped once more, her hand on the frame, looking back at him with the expression he had finally given a name to. Not the almost smile, not the professional assessment, not the careful deliberation, the one where she was letting him see her, actually see her, without the layers that a lifetime of being the billionaire's daughter and then the billionaire herself had accumulated. Just the person, the one who played Chopin badly on Thursday evenings and spent Saturday midnights reading old interviews and wanted someone in the room who was looking at her and not the title. "The presentation," she said. "You said let the room see the work, that it was real." "Yeah, that was good advice. Usually is." She almost smiled. "Don't be smug about it." "I'm being accurate." She left. He heard her heels down the corridor, then the elevator, and then the building's ordinary sounds reasserted themselves. The ventilation, the distant phone, the specific white noise of a professional space doing what professional spaces did. He sat in the empty conference room for another minute with the view of Boston and the quiet and the feeling of something that had been built carefully over a long time and was now standing. Not finished. Buildings were never finished. They just reached a point where you could live in them, but standing. He picked up his phone, texted Sophie's after-school program to confirm Thursday pickup, texted his mother to say he'd be home for dinner, opened his email and responded to 3 things that needed responding to. Then he closed his laptop, looked at the Boston skyline through the glass, the harbor visible in the distance, the afternoon light doing what it did to the city in May, which was make it look like it was worth all the trouble it took. It usually was. He thought about Tuesday night and the train and the coffee at 6:15 and a restaurant booth and the specific quality of Victoria Ashcroft's attention when she was really listening. He thought about an elevator at 14 floors and the way a door could be open an inch without being open all the way, and how sometimes an inch was enough to change the temperature of a room. He thought about Sophie's drawing, the house, the 2 figures, the third one with the long hair in the space where she'd put the sky. He gathered his things, took the elevator down, the one he didn't entirely trust, which today he got into without hesitation. Walked out onto Boylston Street into the May afternoon, which was warm and ordinary and entirely indifferent to the fact that something in him had shifted, was shifting still, the way tectonic things moved, slowly and then all at once and then quietly, as if they'd always been headed here. He walked to his car. He had 3 hours before Sophie needed picking up. He had a governance proposal to think about and a Tuesday night draft to anticipate and a phone call coming tonight after 7 from a woman who was learning a Chopin nocturne very badly and going back every week anyway. He drove home through the Boston afternoon and the city was the same city it had always been. And he was the same person he had always been. And things were different anyway, which was how things worked when the changes were real. Not in the scenery, just in the person moving through it. His phone rang as he hit the on-ramp. His mother. "Dinner at 6, she said. "Sophie wants pasta again." "When does she not?" "She's also informed me that Biscuit was in the yard again this morning." "Of course he was." "She's building a case for a dog, Nathan. It's systematic. I want you to be prepared." He laughed. "I'm prepared." "You're not prepared. She has a spreadsheet, on paper, with crayons." He laughed harder. "I'll be home by 5:30. He hung up, merged onto the highway. The city fell away in the rearview mirror, the skyline shrinking to a line, and then a suggestion, and then the highway's corridor of trees and overpasses, and the ordinary geography of getting from one place to another. In 7 hours, his phone would ring with Victoria's number. He'd pick up. They'd talk about governance structures and possibly not only about governance structures, and somewhere across Boston, she'd be sitting in a room with a patient 70-year-old teacher and a piano she hadn't mastered and a piece of music that sounded like someone feeling something privately, and she'd be choosing to show up for it anyway. Which, he had come to understand, was the whole thing. Not the deal. Not the strategy. Not the title or the portfolio or the largest acquisition in the company's history. The showing up. The choosing to be there. The deciding that something was worth the particular vulnerability of being seen doing it badly, or being seen at all by someone who was paying real attention. That was the whole thing. He put on the radio, drove home. It was a Tuesday in May in Boston, and the air smelled like it meant to stay warm for a while. And he was going home to his daughter and her crayon spreadsheet and the case she was building for a dog. And tonight his phone would ring, and he would pick up. The phone call happened the way she'd said it would. After 7, after the piano lesson, the number appearing on his screen while he was sitting on the back porch with a beer he'd opened 40 minutes ago and mostly forgotten about. He picked up on the second ring. "How was the lesson?" he said, instead of hello. A pause. Then, "She made me play the same 8 measures 14 times. The same 8 measures. The transition in the middle. She stopped. He could hear something in the background that might have been traffic, which meant she was walking, which meant she'd called from the street outside the teacher's building. "I keep tensing before the hard part. She says I'm bracing for the difficulty instead of moving through it. That sounds like useful feedback. It sounds like a description of a personality flaw. Those aren't mutually exclusive." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. He'd been collecting those. The sounds she made that weren't the professional register, the ones that were just her, unedited, arriving through a phone at 9 o'clock on a Thursday. "The governance draft," she said. "I haven't looked at it yet. You said you'd send it Tuesday." "I sent it tonight instead, after the lesson." He looked at his phone. He had an email from her time-stamped 8:47. "I haven't checked email since dinner." "I know. I sent it knowing you wouldn't see it until tomorrow, which is why I'm telling you now." "What's in it?" A pause. The street sound in the background settled. She'd stopped walking. "Most of what you'd expect: scope definition, deliverable structure, accountability framework." Diane reviewed the conflict of interest language. Another pause. "And a section at the end that Diane didn't review." He waited. "I wrote it myself," Victoria said. "Late, after the draft was otherwise done." She was using the careful voice, the one that meant she was being more honest than comfortable. "It outlines how we handle the personal relationship inside a professional structure, not legally. That part is covered elsewhere. This is the philosophy of it. How we protect both things without pretending one of them doesn't exist." Nathan looked at the dark backyard. Sophie's swing set was visible in the porch light, the swings slightly moving in the May breeze without anyone in them. "You wrote a philosophy section," he said. "I wrote what I thought needed to be said. You can disagree with it." "I haven't read it." "When you do." She paused. "Tell me what you actually think, not the version that's trying to be diplomatic." "Have I ever given you the diplomatic version?" "Once or twice. You're better at directness than you give yourself credit for, but you still do the reframing thing sometimes when you don't want to have the harder conversation." He was quiet for a second. She wasn't wrong, which was the specific irritation of being known accurately by someone. "I'll read it tonight," he said. "You don't have to." "I'll read it tonight. I'll call you tomorrow." A pause. "Okay." "Victoria." "Yes?" "The 8 measures," he said. "You'll get through them." The not quite laugh again. "My teacher says I will. She says I'm stubborn enough." "She's right." "Good night, Nathan." "Good night." He read the governance draft at 10:15, after Sophie was asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime self. The professional sections were exactly what he'd expected: thorough, well-structured, Diane's legal precision evident throughout. The conflict of interest language was specific and workable, the kind of framework that acknowledged reality rather than trying to legislate it away. The section at the end was different. She titled it simply, "On Working with Someone You Have Also Chosen." It was 4 paragraphs. No bullet points, no subheadings, just the clean, clear prose she wrote when she was writing for herself rather than for the company. She wrote that professional relationships and personal ones weren't separable once they'd become entangled, and that pretending otherwise was the kind of dishonesty that corroded both. She wrote that the goal wasn't to keep the two things apart, but to keep them honest, to be clear, always, about when a decision was professional and when it was personal and when it was both, and to have a framework for talking about that distinction without either person losing themselves to the other's context. She wrote, "The risk isn't conflict of interest. The risk is losing the quality of attention that makes the work good. What makes this work good is that we're both fully present for it. That requires protecting the conditions that allow full presence, which means neither person can subsume what they are into what the other needs. We have to remain, each of us, the person the other chose. Nathan read that paragraph twice. Then he read it a third time. He put the laptop down, sat in the kitchen in the quiet, with the paragraph and what it said and what it meant that she had written it, had found those specific words at some point late at night after a piano lesson, and sent them to him knowing he would read them and understand what she was actually saying. We have to remain, each of us, the person the other chose. He'd spent 4 years after Jess building the wall his mother had named, building it carefully, brick by brick, calling it protection, because protection was the right word for what Sophie needed, and the wrong word for what he'd extended it to cover. He'd stopped being the person who let things in because letting things in meant losing things, and losing things hurt in a way he'd decided he wasn't willing to do again. The wall had worked. Sophie was good, was whole, was the best thing in his life. The professional life was genuinely good. The work he was proud of, the reputation earned rather than inherited, the specific satisfaction of doing something difficult well. But his mother had said, sometimes protection becomes the only mode you have. And standing on the Boylston Street sidewalk on a Monday night in May, he'd looked at a woman who had her own architecture of protection and thought, yeah, enough of this. He picked up the phone. It was 10:43. He texted, read it, all of it. The last section is the best thing either of us has written in the past 8 months, and we can argue about that tomorrow. But I wanted you to know tonight. The response took 6 minutes. He imagined her reading it twice the way he always read her messages, checking it for what she'd actually said against what she'd meant to say. That's the diplomatic version. He smiled. Typed back, the direct version is that you scared me a little, which means you got it right. A longer pause, then, good. Go to sleep, Nathan. He went to sleep. The governance framework was formally approved by the board 3 weeks later. Diane had added 2 provisions to the final section, both reasonable, both the kind of thing that a legally sound document needed, and that the personal philosophy version couldn't substitute for. Victoria had incorporated them without complaint. Nathan had reviewed the final version and signed it in the Boylston Street conference room on a Wednesday morning while Marcus Webb made a joke about paper trails that nobody laughed at, which Marcus acknowledged and moved on from with the resilience of a man who had survived worse rooms. What changed after the framework was signed was not dramatic. Nothing changed overnight. What changed was the texture of the daily work, the emails, the calls, the sessions in the conference room, and occasionally in Nathan's own office on the Cambridge side of the river, which Victoria had visited twice now, and which she'd looked around with the attention of someone inventorying a place rather than just passing through it. She'd noticed the paper notebooks immediately. You have 12 of them, she said, on the first visit. That seems about right. That's aggressively retro. Your assistant told me the same thing 8 months ago. My assistant is wrong about most things, but occasionally right. She picked up the top notebook, put it down without opening it, which he noted. It works for you. It does. The way the piano works for me. Badly at first. She looked at him. Still somewhat badly. But you go back. Every Thursday. She looked at the notebook again. She told me last week that I'm getting somewhere, which from her means I'm almost not terrible. High praise. Extraordinary praise coming from her. What changed in the weeks after the framework was that the space between professional and personal became less of a line Nathan was careful not to cross, and more of a room they both moved through with increasing ease. He called her on a Saturday when he was reviewing the Meridian integration timeline and had a question that couldn't wait, and she answered from what sounded like a grocery store, which was somehow the most humanizing thing he'd ever heard from her. The particular background noise of a person doing ordinary Saturday errands, cartwheels on tile, and the overhead announcement about a sale on something he didn't catch. You're at a grocery store, he said. I also eat food. I know, what's the question, Nathan? He asked the question. She answered it, correctly, efficiently, from the middle of a grocery store on a Saturday, and then said, "Anything else?" And he said, "No, that's it." And she said, "What? Good, I need to find the olive oil," and hung up. He stood in his kitchen and felt something he could only describe as fond, which was not a professional feeling and which he stopped trying to categorize. The harder thing, the thing that didn't resolve itself in 3 weeks or with a signed governance document, was Sophie. Not because Sophie was difficult about it. She wasn't. She was 6 going on 7, and her primary concerns were Biscuit the Beagle next door and the book report she had technically completed but was reconsidering. And she absorbed new information about her world with the practical flexibility of a child who had always lived in a world that required flexibility. The harder thing was Nathan. What to say and when to say it, and how to introduce the idea of Victoria into Sophie's daily reality without either minimizing what Victoria was or overstating what it might become. He talked to his mother about it on a Sunday afternoon while Sophie was in the backyard engaged in what appeared to be a complex diplomatic negotiation with Biscuit through the fence. "Just be honest with her," his mother said. "She's smarter than you give her credit for." "I give her enormous credit." "You give her appropriate credit for a 6-year-old. She's not 6 on the inside." "She's literally 6. Her father spent 5 years being lonely and working very hard, and she has watched this. Children watch." His mother looked out the window at Sophie, who was now apparently explaining something to Biscuit at length. "She drew a third figure on her nightstand, Nathan. She already knows something is different." He looked at his mother. "When did you see the drawing?" "I put her laundry away. The drawing's still there." A pause. "She hasn't changed it. She's waiting." That evening, after dinner, Nathan sat on Sophie's bed while she arranged her stuffed animals in the specific configuration that was apparently required before sleep could be initiated, and he said, "Soph, you remember Victoria from the FaceTime in New York?" Sophie looked at him with the expression of a child who had been waiting for a conversation and was trying not to show that she'd been waiting. "Your work person," she said. "Right, she's—" He paused. "She's also my friend. A real friend. Not just work." Sophie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Like how Clara is my best friend, but we're also in the same reading group? Something like that. Does she know about me?" "She knows about you. She knows you like green grapes and you're very specific about lunch." Sophie's face did the thing it did when information pleased her. "Did you tell her about Biscuit?" "I think she's heard about Biscuit." "Okay." She picked up her favorite stuffed animal, a rabbit named Carl for reasons that had never been fully explained, and settled him into his designated position. "Can I meet her?" "If you want to." "I want to." She said it simply, without drama. Then, "Dad?" "Yeah." "The drawing on my nightstand." She was looking at Carl rather than Nathan, which was how she talked about things that mattered to her, slightly sideways. "The one with the house." "I saw it. I put someone in it." A pause. "I didn't know who. I just knew there was supposed to be someone." Nathan looked at his daughter. This person he'd built a wall around and also built himself around, the two of them inside their careful structure, which had kept them safe and was now, he understood, ready to be a little less like a wall and a little more like a home. "I know," he said. "I think I did too." Sophie looked at him then, directly, with the dark, wide-set eyes that were Jess's and the directness that was his own. "Is it her?" she asked. He held his daughter's gaze. "I think it might be." She nodded once, with the gravity of someone filing important information. Then she held Carl up. "Carl says okay." Carl's judgment is sound. "He knows things," Sophie confirmed, and turned over to sleep. The first time Victoria came to the house in Somerville was a Saturday in late June. Not for an occasion. No dinner party, no organized event, just the ordinary Saturday that Nathan had described on the phone the previous week. Sophie had a soccer game in the morning, there would be lunch, the afternoon was unscheduled. "You could come," he'd said, and then, "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "What time is the soccer game?" She arrived at the field at 10:15. Nathan saw her walking toward the sideline from 20 yards away. She was in clothes he'd never seen, genuinely casual, jeans and a light jacket. which somehow surprised him even though it shouldn't have. He'd known intellectually that she owned casual clothes. Seeing her in them was different. She stood beside him on the sideline. Sophie was on the field, playing left midfielder with the focused energy of a child who took soccer seriously, partly because she was genuinely good at it, and partly because she was competitive in the way that ran in her family. "Which one is she?" Victoria asked. "Number 7, the one currently arguing with the referee." Victoria looked. Sophie was indeed in a spirited discussion with the teenage referee about a call that had not gone her way. The referee was holding his ground, which was the correct professional decision. Sophie accepted the ruling with visible reluctance and went back to her position. "She argues with referees," Victoria said. "She argues with everyone. It's a phase." He paused. "It's probably not a phase." Victoria watched Sophie on the field for a moment. He watched Victoria watching Sophie. The specific quality of her attention, which was the same attention she brought to everything she decided mattered, present and undefended, and slightly careful, like someone learning the weight of a new thing before committing to how to carry it. "She's fast," Victoria said. "She's been fast since she learned to walk. Her pediatrician said it like it was a warning." Sophie scored in the 23rd minute, a left-footed shot from the edge of the box that went in cleanly and caused her to sprint toward the sideline with her arms out in the theatrical manner of someone who had been waiting for this moment. She stopped when she saw Victoria standing beside her father. The theatrical run became a walk. She came over with the assessment face, head slightly tilted, evaluating. "You came," Sophie said. "Your dad mentioned the game," Victoria said. "I wanted to see." "Did you see my goal?" "I saw it." "It was a good one." "It was." Sophie looked at her for another moment with the directness that had always been her default mode. Then she said, "Your jacket is nice." Victoria looked down at it. "Thank you." "Okay," Sophie said, satisfied, and ran back onto the field. Nathan looked at Victoria. She was looking at the field, her expression doing the thing he'd learned to read, the one where something had moved her and she was deciding what to do with it. "She's very direct," Victoria said. "Comes with the territory." "I like it." A pause. "I understand it." He didn't say anything. Some moments didn't need commentary. They just needed to be inside. After the game, Sophie's team won, 3-1. Sophie providing 1 goal and 1 assist and 1 particularly dramatic fall that produced no injury but significant theatrical effect. They went back to the house. Sophie talked for the entire drive, recounting the game in detail that was both accurate and enhanced, and Victoria sat in the passenger seat listening with the specific quality of someone who was genuinely interested rather than politely present. Lunch was sandwiches, which Nathan made while Sophie showed Victoria the backyard and the fence, and Biscuit, who happened to be in the neighbor's yard, and Nathan watched through the kitchen window as his daughter introduced Victoria to a beagle through a chain-link fence with the gravity of someone introducing 2 important people at a significant occasion. Victoria crouched down to look at the dog through the fence, said something Nathan couldn't hear. Sophie laughed. The full version, the one she gave to things that were actually funny to her, not the polite version. Nathan turned back to the sandwiches. He cut them diagonally. Lunch was the ordinary kind. The table a little full with Sophie's energy, which always expanded to fill available space, with Victoria navigating it carefully and not perfectly, occasionally not knowing where to step, but recovering without making it a production. She asked Sophie about the book report. Sophie gave her a detailed account of its composition, which included 2 revisions and a significant disagreement with Nathan about the concluding paragraph. "What was the disagreement?" Victoria asked. "Dad said I should end with what the book meant to me. I said I didn't want to. It felt like showing too much." Victoria looked at her. "What did you end up writing?" "What it meant to me." Sophie picked up her grape. "He was right." "He usually is," Victoria said, and Nathan looked up from his sandwich and found her looking at him with the expression he'd finally named, the open one, the one that had surprised her the first time and which she'd stopped trying to manage, which was the best thing she'd given him, better than the strategy and the partnership and the late-night emails, just that. Stop trying to manage what she felt in front of him. After lunch, Sophie disappeared upstairs for the specific post-soccer game crash that Nathan had learned to anticipate, leaving the kitchen quiet and the afternoon extended in front of them without agenda. Nathan made coffee. Victoria sat at the kitchen table, which she did now without the slight formal quality she'd had the first time she'd been in a space that was his rather than professional. "She's extraordinary," Victoria said. "I know." He set a mug in front of her. "She's also a lot." "She's a lot in the way that things worth a lot are a lot." Victoria wrapped her hands around the mug. "She makes the room feel occupied. She gets that from her mother." He said it simply, the way he'd learned to say it, without the weight that used to come with it, which didn't mean the weight was gone, just that he'd gotten better at carrying it without letting it change his posture. Jess was like that, present in a way that you felt. Victoria looked at him. "Tell me about her." He'd expected the question and was still slightly unprepared for it. He thought about the deflection available to him, the subject change, the brevity, the version of the story that gave enough to satisfy without giving what it actually cost to tell. He didn't take it. He told her about Jess, not the tragedy of it, not the ending, but the person. How she'd been a high school art teacher who brought the same chaotic, generative energy to her classroom that Sophie brought to every room she entered. And how Nathan had fallen in love with her at 26 in the way you fell in love at 26, completely and without much strategy, and how they'd had 4 years that were genuinely good, not perfect. They fought about money and about his work hours and about whether to get a dog. Sophie's position on dogs was, he noted, not new. And then the Tuesday in March, and the hospital, and the specific unbearable fact of a world that continued anyway. "I didn't fall apart," he said. "That surprised me. I thought I would. I had Sophie and I had work, and I had my mother showing up 3 days later with a suitcase and just staying, and the machinery of daily life doesn't stop for grief. It just incorporates it, and eventually—" He paused. "Eventually the grief becomes part of the structure rather than the thing destroying the structure. It's still there. It's just load-bearing now." Victoria was quiet. She wasn't trying to respond yet, which was what he'd needed from her. Just the listening, the actual presence. "You never tried again," she said. "After." "I told myself it was for Sophie, that it was protection." He looked at his coffee. "It was partly true. And partly it was easier to be certain of loss than uncertain of something new." "Until," she said. "Until," he agreed. She looked at him across the kitchen table, the ordinary kitchen table in the Somerville house with Sophie's school artwork still on the refrigerator, and the specific comfortable disorder of a house that was actually lived in. And what she said next, she said without the careful voice, without the managed register, just directly, the way she said things when she'd stopped calculating the cost. "I've been afraid of this," she said. "Not you specifically, the size of it. You and Sophie, that's not... I'm not walking into something small, and I haven't..." She stopped. Started again. "I've been very good at things that could be contained. Work, projects, problems with solutions. This doesn't have a solution." "No," Nathan said. "It doesn't." "That's supposed to be reassuring?" "It's supposed to be honest." He looked at her. "You don't need it to have a solution. You need it to be worth the uncertainty." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the June afternoon was warm and full, the kind of day that Boston produced occasionally, as if to compensate for everything it put you through from November to April. Generous, unhurried, the light in the backyard coming through the kitchen window and landing on the table between them. "It's worth it," she said. "I want you to know that. I've been circling it for weeks and I'm done circling." She met his eyes. "It's worth it." He reached across the table. Not dramatically, just put his hand on the table, palm up, and she looked at it for a moment and then put her hand in it, and they sat there in the kitchen of his house on a Saturday in June with the light coming in and the upstairs quiet and the ordinary afternoon around them. It wasn't the elevator, and it wasn't the coffee shop, and it wasn't the restaurant in New York, or the boardroom, or any of the places where things had almost been said and then not been said. It was the kitchen, the ordinary kitchen, with the dinosaur magnet on the refrigerator and the slightly uneven table and the very average coffee he'd made and the sound of a house where a child was asleep upstairs. It was the right place, He hadn't known until it was happening, but it was. The months that followed were not a montage. That was the thing about real life that stories tended to skip over. The way change happened not in a series of clean turning points, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary days, each one unremarkable individually and significant in aggregate. Victoria met Nathan's mother on a Sunday in July. Ellen Mercer made tea and asked Victoria direct questions about the company and about her father and about the piano, and Victoria answered them all with the honesty she'd been practicing and didn't try to manage Ellen's impression of her, which Ellen registered and approved of without saying so directly, which was how Ellen Mercer communicated approval and which Nathan translated for Victoria afterward. "She liked you," he said in the car afterward. "She was evaluating me." "She was. And she liked you." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "She asked me whether I knew about Jess." "What did you say?" "That you'd told me. That I understood what I was. What it meant, walking into what you and Sophie have." She looked at the window. She said good. He needed someone who'd take the whole thing seriously. Nathan drove. "I'm taking it seriously," Victoria said. "I want you to know that. It's not, I don't think of Sophie as a complication or a condition. She paused. "She's part of what Another pause. "She's important to me. Already." "I know," Nathan said. "I'm not sure I know how to do this. She gestured vaguely, which was not a Victoria Ashcroft gesture. She was not a vague gesturer, which told him how far outside her usual territory this was. The being someone to a child. "I didn't have—" She stopped. "My mother left when I was 8. My father, he was present, but the company was always also present. And I learned early that the way you showed love in our family was by working hard for the thing you were building together. Which is," she exhaled, "which is a limited vocabulary." Nathan glanced over at her. "Sophie doesn't need a vocabulary she's already heard. She needs someone who shows up. I show up. I know you do." He looked back at the road. "Every Thursday, to play the same 8 measures 14 times. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing," he said. "You show up for things that are hard and that you can't control the outcome of, and you do it again the next week. That's the whole skill." He looked at her briefly. "You already have it. You've had it for a while." She didn't respond, but when he reached across and put his hand briefly on hers on the center console, she turned her hand over and held it, and didn't let go until they reached the exit. Sophie's 7th birthday was in September. She requested a party with a specific theme that had changed 4 times in the preceding 6 weeks, and finally settled on dogs, which Nathan accepted as both thematically consistent and a long game he'd apparently been losing for 2 years. Victoria came to the party. She did not try to be Sophie's friend in the orchestrated way that adults sometimes tried to be children's friends, performing interest and crouching to eye level and asking questions in the exaggerated manner of a television host. She just showed up and paid attention and followed Sophie's lead, which Sophie, it turned out, appreciated exactly. At one point during the party, the low-stakes chaos of 8 7-year-olds with cake, Sophie grabbed Victoria's hand to pull her toward the backyard to show her something, the natural, unself-conscious grab of a child who had decided you were someone she could grab, and Victoria went, holding the small hand with the care of someone holding something that mattered. And Nathan stood in the kitchen doorway watching the two of them cross the backyard toward the fence where Biscuit was, as always, available for a visit. And he thought, there it is. Not the feeling of completion because nothing was complete. The governance framework had had its first real test 2 months earlier when a board member had questioned a campaign decision Nathan had made, and the conversation that followed had been uncomfortable and necessary and had taken 2 days to work through properly. The professional and personal entangled in exactly the way the philosophy section had predicted, and they'd gotten through it, but not without cost. Not seamlessly. Not without Nathan driving home afterward feeling like he'd spent a day in the kind of weather that got into your bones. But they'd gotten through it, and that was what the backyard showed him. Not that it was easy, but that it was real. Victoria crossing the yard with Sophie's hand in hers toward a beagle through a fence. The September afternoon around them. impermanent and ordinary and entirely itself. The creative venture started as a conversation and became, over the fall, something more deliberate. Victoria had been thinking about it since before New York. She'd mentioned it once, briefly, on the train, in the context of wondering whether what she built needed to always be what she'd inherited. A smaller operation. More focused, something that applied the stewardship philosophy to something new, rather than to the management of what existed. A hospitality consultancy, she said one evening, sitting at Nathan's kitchen table with her laptop and the remains of dinner. Not competing with Ashcroft, complementing it. Working with independent properties that want to grow without losing what makes them work. You'd be working with properties like the Meridian ones were before the acquisition. Exactly like those. She looked at the screen. I've been thinking about it since Thomas Beaumont's phrase. Someone was happy they arrived. That's the whole thing. That's what gets lost when hospitality becomes purely industrial. And what's my role in this? She looked at him. What do you want it to be? He considered it. Strategic and creative direction, not execution. I'm not dissolving my firm, but the foundational work. The architecture. That's what I was thinking. She looked back at the screen. It would be smaller than what either of us does independently. Less revenue, at least initially. More deliberate. You're not doing this for the revenue. No. What are you doing it for? She was quiet for a moment, looking at something in the middle distance that wasn't the laptop. Because I've spent 10 years building something my father started, and I'm proud of it. And I want to build something that I started. That is, she paused, that is made of what I actually believe. He looked at her across the kitchen table. She was 30 years old and had run a company since she was 26 and had played the Chopin Nocturne badly every Thursday for 8 months, and had walked across a Somerville backyard holding his daughter's hand, and had written a philosophy section about what it meant to remain the person the other person had chosen. Okay, he said. Okay? Yes. She looked at him. You're not going to need a week to think about it? I've been thinking about it since you mentioned it on the train. A pause. I mentioned it once, briefly. I know, I thought about it anyway. He looked at the table. The Meridian work, the stewardship framework, that's the best strategic work I've done in years, possibly ever. I want to do more of it. With me specifically, or Victoria. She stopped. With you specifically, he said. She looked at her laptop for a moment, then she closed it. The deliberate close, the one that meant she was done working for the night and present for whatever came after. We'll need a name, she said. We will. Something that isn't either of our last names. Agreed. I'll think about it. So will I. He stood, picked up the dinner plates. Sophie had an idea last week, for the record. Victoria looked up. You told Sophie? I mentioned we were thinking about a new project. She asked questions. She always asks questions. He brought the plates to the sink. Her suggestion was something with the word home in it. Victoria was quiet. She said, a good hotel is like a home, but for people who need one for a while, Nathan said. She heard Thomas Beaumont's phrase, apparently, from the presentation materials I left on the table once. She read your presentation materials. She reads everything she can reach. It's a problem. He turned off the water, turned around. But she's not wrong about the word. Victoria was looking at the middle distance again, but differently now. The way she looked when something had found its right place. Something with home, she said. Something with home, he agreed. They spent the winter building it, slowly, around everything else, the way you built things that were meant to last. The name they landed on was simple. Hearth and Standard, which Nathan had suggested on a Thursday evening over the phone after a week of options that hadn't quite been right, and which Victoria had been quiet about for 15 seconds before saying, yes, that's it. The framework for the new venture was filed in January. The Ashcroft board signed off on the structure. No conflict, clearly delineated, Diane's legal precision applied to the separation of interests with the thoroughness it deserved. The first client came through a referral from Thomas Beaumont, who had heard about the venture through Clara, who had called Victoria in November to say that the post-acquisition integration was going better than she'd expected, and that she had a colleague in Vermont who had been looking for exactly this kind of work. The Vermont property was a family-run inn that had been operating since the 70s, and that had reached the specific crossroads that small hospitality businesses reached when the generation that built them was ready to step back, and the generation inheriting them needed to understand what they were inheriting. Nathan flew up in February to walk the property. Victoria came 2 days later. They met the family, 3 siblings in their mid-30s who were simultaneously committed to the inn and terrified of what commitment would cost them, and spent 2 days listening, not presenting, listening, the way Thomas Beaumont had said he'd wanted someone to listen 30 years ago before he'd learned to ask for it. On the drive back to the airport, Victoria looked out at the Vermont winter, February serious, the kind of cold that had committed, and said, "This is what it's supposed to feel like." "Yeah," Nathan said. "The Ashcroft work was right. This is more right. Both things can be true." "I know." She looked at him. "I'm not leaving Ashcroft. I'm adding this. I'm adding—" She paused. "I'm adding the thing I do because I believe it rather than because I inherited it." He looked at the road. "Your father would understand that." "He does understand it. He told me last month." A pause. "He said it took him 15 years to learn the difference between building for obligation and building for belief. He's glad I'm learning it at 30. They drove through the Vermont cold, and the heater worked inconsistently in the rental car, and the road needed plowing and hadn't been yet, and they were quiet in the way of 2 people who had said what needed saying and were comfortable now with the silence that followed. At the airport, standing at the security line where they'd be going separate gates, Nathan's flight was 40 minutes before hers. She said, "The piano teacher." "What about her?" "She told me last week that I've learned the 8 measures." Victoria was looking at her boarding pass, not at him. "She said I stopped bracing and started moving through it. That's the whole skill," he said. She looked up. The open expression, the one she'd stopped managing, the one that was just hers, just her, the person under the position, and the portfolio and the careful architecture of a life built to protect something that had always been worth protecting. "I know," she said. "I've been practicing." He kissed her there, at the airport security line in Vermont in February, which was not a planned moment and which was witnessed by approximately 7 people who had no context for it and didn't need any. She kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything she decided was worth doing. Fully, without reservation, the way you did something when you'd stopped calculating whether you could afford it. When he pulled back, she was still looking at him, and he was looking at her, and the security line moved around them with the ordinary impatience of people trying to get somewhere. "Go," she said. "You'll miss your flight." "I won't." "You might." "I won't." He picked up his bag. "I'll call you from Boston." "I know you will." He went through security. At the first bend in the line, he looked back. She was still standing where he'd left her, boarding pass in hand, watching him go. And she didn't wave and he didn't wave, but she was still looking and he was still looking, and that was enough. In the end, what Nathan understood, not in a flash, not in any single moment, but gradually, the way you understood things that were worth understanding was that love was not the dramatic arrival of something new. It was the recognition of what had been building the whole time. 8 months of friction that was never indifference. Late-night emails and phone calls, and a train ride where neither of them could stop working long enough to pretend they weren't exactly where they needed to be. 2 words in a boardroom. A hand held across a kitchen table. A child walking across a September backyard toward a fence and a beagle, and a woman who was learning for the first time that showing up was the vocabulary she'd been missing. He'd spent 4 years protecting the life he had. It was a good life, a real one, built on loss and love, and the ordinary difficult work of raising a person alone in a world that didn't accommodate that work as well as it should. He didn't regret the wall. It had kept them safe when safe was what they needed. But his mother had been right. Protection that never opened was just a smaller room. And Victoria, difficult, precise, midnight researching, badly piano-playing Victoria, had not asked him to take the wall down. She just stood outside it long enough, with enough patience and enough honesty and enough of her own walls coming down, that eventually he'd done it himself. That was the thing about choosing someone. It wasn't one decision, it was the accumulation of small ones. The phone picked up, the call made, the philosophy section written at midnight, the hand palm up on the kitchen table, the airport line in February, the showing up, the staying. Sophie put a new drawing on her nightstand in March. Same house, same two figures. Same third figure with the long hair. But this time she'd added something. A dog in the corner, brown and white. A name tag visible in the crayon detail. The name tag said Biscuit. Nathan saw it when he was putting laundry away and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it with the particular feeling of a life that had made room for more than he'd planned to let in and was better for it in the complicated, imperfect, entirely real way that things were better when they were actually true. Sophie got a dog in April, a beagle, 8 weeks old, from a rescue organization in Somerville that had been recommended by, improbably, Clara Beaumont, who had mentioned offhand on a call about the Vermont property that she volunteered there on weekends. Sophie named him Biscuit too. The original Biscuit, she clarified, was still next door and remained a friend. Biscuit 2 was family. Victoria was there the day they brought him home. She sat on the kitchen floor while Biscuit 2 investigated the house with the anarchic energy of a small animal encountering a large world, and Sophie gave her a running commentary on his behavior and his personality and his opinions, which Sophie had apparently already determined in the 40 minutes since the adoption. "He likes you," Sophie told Victoria. Biscuit 2 was currently chewing on Victoria's shoelace with great commitment. "He's very focused," Victoria said. "He knows things," Sophie said. "Like Carl." Victoria looked at her. "Carl?" "My rabbit." Sophie held up Carl for inspection. "He said you were okay." Victoria looked at the stuffed rabbit with the seriousness the introduction deserved. "Please tell Carl I appreciate that." Sophie made Carl nod. "He knows," she said. Nathan stood in the doorway of his kitchen, watching his daughter and the woman he had chosen sitting on his kitchen floor with a beagle puppy between them and a stuffed rabbit as moderator, and he thought about all the things he'd spent 4 years being careful with, his time, his heart, the specific territory of his daily life, and how the carefulness had been right, and also how it had been a preparation for this rather than a destination. You couldn't know in advance what you were making room for. You could only make the room and see. The room was full now. Imperfectly, loudly, in the ongoing way of a life that was being built rather than one that had been finished. There would be board meetings where the entanglement was uncomfortable, and conflicts that required the governance framework to do the work it was designed to do, and evenings when Nathan and Victoria disagreed about something significant and had to find the way through, which they always did, and which never got entirely easy. There would be days when Sophie missed her mother in the specific aching way of children who had lost something before they were old enough to understand the loss. And Nathan would sit beside her and hold the weight of that with her, and Victoria would learn, slowly, how to be present for those moments without trying to fix them, which was its own kind of skill that couldn't be acquired all at once. There would be Thursday piano lessons and late-night governance emails, and the Vermont Inn, and whatever came after Vermont, and the ongoing ordinary dailiness of a life shared between people who were each, still, the person the other had chosen. But on a Saturday in April, with a beagle puppy and a stuffed rabbit and a 7-year-old who believed both of them knew things, Nathan Mercer stood in the doorway of his own house and felt simply that he was in the right place. Not because everything was resolved, because it was real. And real, he'd learned, was the whole thing. The piano in the corner of the living room was Victoria's. She'd had it moved in on a Thursday morning in February, which Nathan had not been home for, but which Sophie had supervised with great authority, according to his mother's text, which included a photo of Sophie standing beside the movers pointing at where it should go with the posture of a property manager. She played it on Thursday evenings now, when she was at the house, which was more often than not. The Chopin Nocturne mostly, still with mistakes. Still with the same measures that required the same care, but through them now, the way her teacher had said, not bracing, moving through. Nathan heard it from the kitchen sometimes while he was doing the dishes or making Sophie's lunch for the next day. The particular sound of it, the piano, the practiced imperfection, someone in the next room feeling something privately and not hiding it, was the sound of his house, his actual house, The one being built in real time from the materials of two people deciding daily that the uncertainty was worth it. He cut the sandwich diagonally. He put the grapes in the container, the green ones. He closed the lunchbox and listened to the music from the next room. And outside, the April night was doing what April nights in Boston did when they finally meant it, which was be generous and unhurried and entirely present. And the house held all of it: the music, the sleeping child, the dog, the ordinary beautiful weight of a life that had made room. He stood in his kitchen and let himself have it, all of it.